Come one, come all, fillies and gentle colts. It's time for every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 1 Revisited. This is an extension of every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Reviewed, where I go back to previous seasons, though this time I have a better idea of how to actually review an episode, and I'm leaning purely on my own understanding, not of any other reviewers, and as a result, how I'll rate these episodes will reflect how I actually feel about them. But that's only one of two reasons why I'm revisiting the show from Season 1 and onward. But there's also a second one, that being that I did not like Season 6 and 7 much at all. And those were the seasons I started to think for myself because, after a certain point, I could not accept what others thought about the episodes that I thought were just absolutely disgusting to me. But don't worry, I want to minimize how often I mention episodes from future seasons in this video. If I think it's topical, I'll bring it up, but I'm not gonna rate the episodes from older seasons because of older episodes having new episodes possibly break whatever happened before. So for example, I'm not gonna give the Cutie Chronicles flack for not having Mod Pie shown in the episode at all, or say Boast Busters is any worse than episode it already is because of Magic Duel or No Second Prances. Just my opinion, I don't think it's very fair, and it wouldn't be these episodes' faults either. One more note, but you're probably familiar with my old rating system of good episodes, okay episodes, and nightmare episodes. But here's a refresher. Good episodes, in my opinion, are just that. Episodes I would consider good. I don't touch on how good they are, but you'll have to wait for the end of the video to see what my top 5 would be. For an episode to be considered good, I'd have to first and foremost find it enjoyable. It sounds vague, but when you hear what I actually have to say about good episodes, hopefully it paints a picture of what I'm actually looking for. Meanwhile, there's okay episodes. For these, I have to see a solid story somewhere in what I'm actually watching. A few less than stellar writing choices won't deny an episode being considered good, but I would consider it a slippery slope. Really, it all comes down to having at least a decent structure to the storytelling, where I can at least see where all the points connect. And finally, we have nightmare episodes. For these, the story itself would have to feel incomplete, as in there are loose ends that are overlooked, which I would actively consider important. I could be left frustrated, bored, maybe bewildered if the characterization is really bad. Really, for me to call an episode a nightmare episode, I would have to either think that the episode failed at what it wanted to do, or it makes me as a viewer feel bad in a way I'm convinced would not be intentional from the show itself. I want to make known though that these are not hard rules that determine what category an episode will be classified under. It's very possible that an episode I would call a nightmare episode would actually be a guilty pleasure. And for those, trust me, you'll know them when you see them. And that's all I have to say to start, so let's begin. Episodes 1 and 2. Friendship is Magic. Twilight Sparkle, a reclusive and aloof unicorn, is tasked with making friends and defeating Nightmare Moon. I'll be straight with you all. This being the pilot, I'm not really sure where to start when I talk about it. But let's try from this angle. From how I understand this show from how Lauren Faust conceived it, she essentially wanted Generation 4 of My Little Pony to basically be how she saw the toys when she was growing up with them. With that in mind, the pilot actually does a lot. Instead of just being something mundane like say a tea party or a birthday party that has to be celebrated, there's lore and actual conflict. Character development, which may sound odd that I'm bringing attention to this, but within context of how this franchise is treated in previous generations, this is a massive step forward in trying to make this more approachable for all ages. Which Lauren Faust has also gone on record saying is what she wanted to do with this show. That alone makes me respect the pilot a lot more, seeing just how much more effort had to go into it to make it enjoyable for everyone and not just its target demographic. So yes, Lauren's vision I can very clearly see be reflected in her work. As far as the story itself, I think it's pretty alright, though that's largely given because of how much the first episode has to do given the rest of the show has to follow off of it. I feel like the pilot spreads itself really thin trying to do too much at once. First it has to tell us about the lore, then it has to tell us about the main characters including the main 6 and Spike. Then there's the epic adventure where the main 6 grow closer and start to really love each other as friends. Finally the villain's defeated and we get to see the direction of the rest of the season as well. It feels cluttered, like it's trying to do too much in only 44 minutes total. And that as a result does lead to some elements of this episode being rushed, no pun intended. But before we get negative, let's be positive for a little bit longer. As characters, I think the main 6 are all rather well defined. Some do feel a little hyperbolic like Pinkie Pie and Fluttershy, but I'd rather have more information to go off of than not enough of it. Though the fact that the pilot has to do so much heavy lifting also just means that they don't get to interact with each other very much. The only characters these 5 new mares really interact with are Spike and Twilight. Obviously this will be addressed throughout the first season, but I would say it hurts the second half a fair bit. Because regarding how the main six have to go across every obstacle Nightmare Moon puts in front of them, you have very little to actually go off of to develop them as well. It also doesn't help that some of what we actually see of the main five tells us virtually nothing about them. Like, we see that Applejack has a massive family, but that tells us literally nothing about her own attributes. The most I can really tell for Applejack is that she can be very physically strong, being an earth pony that works on the farm. But regarding part 2 where her elements put to the test, nothing in the first half is reflected here at all. I think it's fair to make this criticism as well, because most of the main six don't have this problem. The first half, we see Fluttershy loves animals. The second half, she tames the Manticore for compassion. You can easily make the connection for kindness given that. Same with Rarity. First half, she's shown to have an eye for beauty. Second half, she sees Steven Magnet and how he lost his mustache, and makes the sacrifice of her own tail to placate him. A connection with generosity can be drawn there. By comparison, I don't know why Applejack can't just tell Twilight that Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash would catch her when she's teetering at the edge of a cliff. What reason is there to be so vague and cryptic about what will happen to Twilight when she lets go? It also hardly seems honest, because what is there really for Applejack to lose if she's wrong? Heck, for that matter, why does Twilight have to let go at all? It honestly looks like they could have just chilled and waited until help arrived, so this is just really stupid. Especially when soon after, Rainbow Dash remarks that they only barely got to Twilight in time. For all we know, Twilight hesitating could very well have saved her own life. I think this would work a little bit better if instead of the element being honesty, it was trustworthiness. That seemed to be reflected a lot better in Applejack's trial than honesty, if you ask me. Another issue I have was with Pinkie Pie's trial. To be fair, I imagine that showing off laughter could be rather difficult, so I'm not going to get too hung up over the trial itself. Actually, my biggest problem with this is the fact that we've seen absolutely no evidence leading up to this point that this is how Pinkie Pie deals with fear. A golden rule in storytelling is show, don't tell. But through Pinkie Pie's less than impressive song, we're basically told that Pinkie Pie deals with fear from what she was told by her grandmother. Now, I'm not going to doubt that this actually could have happened earlier in her life, but we the audience aren't exposed to that until now. And outside of being told earlier in the story that Pinkie Pie would be the element of laughter, there's just no build up to this moment. It feels like a Deus Ex Machina. The sad thing is that this could have very easily been addressed. All this episode would have to do is maybe show Pinkie Pie laughing as she's sliding down the cliff with her friends. I could totally buy that Pinkie Pie would just not be aware of the danger that she's actually in. After all, it's not like she was aware of why Twilight was crying in the first part. Then there's Rainbow Dash and her trial. So the problem is very simple. In the first half, we've only ever heard Rainbow Dash be interested in the Wonderbolts. By comparison, the Shadowbolts are a group of nobodies that literally no one's ever heard of before. Also, being the fastest aerial team in the Everfree Forest can mean literally anything. It sounds like Rainbow Dash would have to be extremely dumb to even consider it. Even if she abandoned her friends, it wouldn't keep them from being able to reach the castle. You have two Pegasi. Even if Rainbow Dash were to ditch you, you still had Fluttershy. I get what Lauren was trying to do, have the Shadowbolts appeal to Rainbow Dash's ego. But I feel like this conflict would work better if it was something that Rainbow Dash had a reason to actually care about. Like if maybe the Shadowbolts were already a notable aerial team and maybe Rainbow Dash wanted to be along with them because it'd make her look better to the Wonderbolts. Though now that I think about it, I think that's actually what Lauren was trying to do with this. Because if they had their eyes set on the world, then yeah, Rainbow Dash would absolutely eclipse the Wonderbolts eventually. Either way, of the trials I actually have a problem with, this one's probably the most minor. And amidst it all, I think that the climax is also just really cool. Twilight's moment of recollection where she recounts everything that her friends and herself went through is honestly really cute. And it really sells it in with the show and that friendship is magic. It's also just really hard not to feel at least a little bit fuzzy seeing Celestia and Luna make up. As for what I'd rate this episode given all of this, hard to say really. It's definitely not a bad episode, but I don't think I'd call it quite good either. Fortunately, I can pick neither. I think it's an okay episode. If either Pinkie Pie or Applejack were polished up a little bit more as far as their elements being represented, I think I'd call it good. Because there really is a lot to like about this pilot. It just feels like maybe it could have used some more time in the oven. But all around, I'd say it's passable. Episode 3. The Ticketmaster. Twilight, who's given 2 tickets to the Grand Galloping Gala, must choose one friend to take with her there, and all 5 of them want to go. So before talking about this episode, I think I want to bring attention to the fun fact here. Within the writing credits, this episode features both Lauren Faust and Amy Keating Rogers. The reason for this is that Lauren's original version of this episode was only 11 minutes long before it was mandated to be 22 minutes for each episode in the show. As a result, Amy, Cutie, and Roger stepped in to extend the episode's story, and they both get writing credits for this episode. So right off the bat, this episode has a bit of a troubled production behind it, which sadly really shows when this episode's execution is finally put out there. Though I'm not really sure if it's the biggest problem with this episode. As said earlier, all 5 of Twilight's friends want to go to the Grand Galloping Gala. And in the episode, it's also mentioned that they all have good reasons for wanting to go. Unfortunately, I, the viewer, disagree with that. Of all of Twilight's friends, it seemed pretty clear-cut that Applejack had the strongest motivation for wanting to go. She explains that she could take her business to the gala and be able to raise a lot more money for the farm. And one of the things she mentions doing with the money would be improving the life of her grandmother. That's actually a very selfless reason for wanting to go to the gala, especially compared to the other 4. Rainbow Dash just wants to go to show off to the Wonderbolts. Rarity wants to get hitched with royalty, Pinkie Pie just wants to party, and Fluttershy doesn't even care about the gala at all, she just cares about the garden and the animals in it. Their reasons are all very much self-serving, and most of them sound flawed on the face of them. Because bear in mind, if the gala is anything like how Rarity would describe it, then would Pinkie Pie find whatever she's looking for there at all? Because her vision sounds diametrically opposed to what Rarity would already envision the gala to be like. Also, I think that trying to show up the Wonderbolts at any kind of event will look really bad on you. Sounds like one of those things that's just doomed to backfire. So already the premise is on very shaky footing. Also, remember my comment about how this episode is actually supposed to be 11 minutes long originally? Yeah, that really shows in the first half. Because this all feels really padded out. Like, the first half of this episode could be summed up as exposition, since all it really is the main 6 trying to decide amongst themselves who would get Twilight's extra ticket. And it just goes on and on and on. The second half is more enjoyable at least, I'd say it's a lot funnier, but to be frank, the elements that Twilight's friends are supposed to represent are not reflected well here at all. I understand the production behind this episode's been pretty rocky, so there may not have been much time to be able to figure out a way to write it differently. But what I'd like to see is that Twilight's friends maybe came to realize that they were making her feel bad long before the end of the episode, and they were trying to be genuinely nice friends to Twilight. And what happened instead is that Twilight misconstrued their favors as if they were meant to be repaid. After all, they're meant to be best friends, right? And this episode repeatedly states that Twilight's hungry and she can't think straight. Maybe she's getting delirious. Because really, what honesty can be found in exploiting someone's hunger for an advantage? What generosity is found in trying to guilt trip a friend to be given their +1 ticket? What loyalty is there in abandoning your cause for someone because your kindness is being seen as a weapon to manipulate? What kindness is there in doing favors only when you expect a reward for it? You see my problem with this? All of the main 6, aside from Twilight of course, seem like they're being poorly represented in this episode, and overall it just feels unpleasant. Don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting perfection from the main 6, but nonetheless, this episode could have done a much better job at actually showing the main 6 being friends amongst each other. At the very least, it would have made the ending a lot better paced as well, instead of just seeing the main 6 immediately turn cold when they see Twilight's distressed. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with this episode though. There are a few jokes that got a legitimate laugh out of me after all. Like the highlight where when Rainbow Dash took her favorite back from Twilight, it ended up soaking her and her sandwich. I also think this episode did a decent job setting the tone for how morals will be conducted throughout the entire season, to say nothing of thinking that the moral itself is actually pretty nice. At least out of context. In context, if Celestia didn't give Twilight those extra tickets, it should have been Applejack, no questions asked. That being said, I can still see how choosing Applejack over the other 4 would make Twilight really uncomfortable, which does make her indecisiveness a little easier to understand. I also think the foreshadowing that shows that Princess Celestia didn't write the letter to Twilight was very clever. The way the letter was formatted, it seemed to be in the third person, which would strongly imply that Celestia herself didn't even write it. And Celestia being a princess, I could understand if she was just really busy and didn't have the time to really address Twilight specifically. To that extent, I'm willing to give this episode a pass on that. Don't get me wrong, I am definitely leaning closer to calling this a nightmare episode, but I think it's just barely okay. There are some things I would do differently, but with all due respect, if you smash something hard enough with a hammer, you're going to break it. And I at least enjoyed this episode enough where I would not say I found it outwardly bad. Episode 4, Applebuck Season. A sleep-deprived Applejack harvests an orchard of apples all by herself while trying to help her friends with their tasks. I feel like there's a lot of things that are just really minor in the grand scheme of things that really bother me about this episode. Like near the beginning when Applejack and her dog Winona are trying to herd some cows away from Ponyville. There's nothing really wrong with the herding itself, but when it's panning to the main six and you see them all reacting to what Applejack is actually doing, it's repeatedly switching back and forth with this random blue background Earth pony who has horseshoes for her cutie mark, and Fluttershy. I don't really understand how that actually could happen. Granted, I'm not an animator, but I think it'd be better to just choose one pony to put in that spot, compared to alternating between the two. It's actually really distracting. Pinkie Pie in this episode was also just not doing it for me. I found her pretty annoying when she was mimicking Applejack, and there's a lot wrong with the scene as well where Applejack is actually helping her with the baking. Not only do you have Applejack vocally saying out loud what she's actually putting in the bowl, but Pinkie Pie is also just looking dead at Applejack, and I guess not recognizing the fact that what she's putting in the bowl is not what she asked for. Also, she presumably was actually mixing the ingredients inside the bowl, yet she did not once ever think to look inside the bowl where she would have seen the worms inside. I get that Applejack's supposed to be trustworthy, but this goes beyond trust. This is basically just blindly following someone, and it's not like it was even really funny seeing all those ponies being poisoned either. It's by far the lowest win of this episode for me. Fortunately for Applebuck season, that about sums up all of my biggest problems with this episode. I remember hearing some reviewers say that Applejack should not have learned his moral this early on in the show's lifespan, but I don't really have a problem with that. And that's because I don't expect Applejack to immediately put this moral to heart. I do have a bit of an issue though with how long this episode takes to really get started, since this episode doesn't start getting interesting until Applejack actually starts helping her friends. But after that part, I actually think this episode gets rather enjoyable. I also appreciate the fact that this episode actually does at least try to address the plot hole otherwise of how Applejack's extended family is in Ponyville right now, and it makes enough sense how Big Mac, Apple Bloom, and Granny Smith aren't here to help either. Big Mac is injured, Granny Smith looks way too old to work, and Apple Bloom may very well be too young to work, so I'll give this episode points for that. It doesn't just hope the viewer doesn't remember what happened in the past. The scenes involving Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy I also thought were really funny, especially after the baby bunnies were rampaging Ponyville in the Stampede, and then when Twilight's here to see the aftermath, she's just like, I don't get it. And really it makes a lot of sense, like what are a bunch of baby bunnies really gonna do as far as damage is concerned? I love jokes like that. Something I also want to bring up, though bear in mind, what I've seen in the future in this show has no bearing on what I think of older episodes in the series, since I personally think that retroactively judging something is rather unfair, is that the conflict that Twilight sees with Applejack is actually very similar to what Pinkie Pie saw with the Yaks and not asking for trouble, except that Applejack did accept Twilight and her friends' help before the end of the episode, while the Yaks never did accept Pinkie Pie's help. I don't really mind the offerings in either episode though. For what they're worth, I think they were executed relatively well, though the world building with how cows are sentient and yet they could also be herded, as well as the expression of being stubborn as a mule where there are actual mules in this series that are also sentient is kinda confusing. Not to mention selective, cause Winona's a dog and she can't talk. Manticores presumably can't talk either. It's weird. It ultimately doesn't really matter for this episode's quality, but it's weird. Rest assured though, the episode is not as bad as the muffins that Spike eats out of the garbage. There are some things I could nitpick, like the fact that Twilight just repeatedly teleports for no really good reason, but at most that really is just a nitpick. I'm teetering between good and okay, honestly. I feel like if the beginning was more entertaining, I would call it a good episode, but it's just not quite there. It's decent, but the most that gives you is just being called okay. Rest assured, you could definitely do worse than this. Episode 5, Griffon The Brush Off. Pinkie Pie has to contend with an old friend of Rainbow Dash. So, how did I ever think this episode deserved to be called good? That may come up as a bit of a shock considering that in my original review of this episode I called it okay, but I actually was really close to calling it good officially, and in earlier drafts I did call it a good episode. Now, nada. It's actually a lot worse than I remember it being. Let's start off by saying that I think this episode was already really hit or miss in the first act, which is saying a lot considering that that's also the highlight of this episode for me. Apparently a number of Pinkie Pie's friends consider her to be actually annoying, namely Twilight and Rainbow Dash, which is just a little bit strange considering that they're supposed to be best friends. I get that your friends can annoy you, but it's a pretty off-putting start to the episode. Though to be fair, I find Pinkie Pie to be pretty annoying too, so I can't really give them too much flack for that. Either way, it's here in the first act we hear that Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash both really love pranking others, which is both extremely cute and charming. I really like this part of the episode a lot. What's really great also is that the victims of the pranks take it all just very well, and I think it was smart how the writer chose only targets that were actually friends. And the pranks are designed well for their targets, as well as just not being offensive at all, where I'd think that it'd actually be off-putting to see. All around, I enjoy it a lot. And this plot point does come back later in the episode too, seeing how Gilda also enjoys pranking others, and it is the pranks that actually get Gilda to show her true colors. But this now brings us to Gilda, who I have a ton of problems with. And not so much I have a problem with her because I don't like her. No, I have a problem with her because I think she was executed extremely poorly as an antagonist. And the big part of that has to do with Pinkie Pie, who I have to say I actually really dislike in this episode. Let me explain, because I do see what the writer was trying to do with this story. What Cindy Moore was trying to do was demonstrate the difference between a good friend, aka Pinkie Pie, and a bad friend, aka Gilda. She tried to present her as possessive of Rainbow Dash, basically trying to alienate Rainbow Dash from all of her other friends not named Gilda, in addition to being generally unpleasant as well. The problem is that if you want to sell Gilda as being a bad friend, you can't really do that when Pinkie Pie is the one actively instigating the issue. Before Gilda shows any signs of malice at all in this episode, Rainbow Dash tactfully and respectfully asks Pinkie Pie if she would just let Gilda and Rainbow Dash catch up for a while. And entirely unprompted, Pinkie Pie shows back up and Gilda gets annoyed because she wants to just be alone with Rainbow Dash for a while. It's fair to say that your old friends and your new friends may not necessarily share the same personality types or sense of humor. So while Rainbow Dash may be okay with Pinkie Pie's antics, that doesn't mean that Gilda would be. And here's the kicker. Most reasonable people would see from Gilda's perspective, because Gilda really isn't obligated to put up with Pinkie Pie either. And it's generally a bad look if someone cannot respect that maybe you just don't want to be around them. You know, the behavior that we've seen Pinkie Pie demonstrate in the beginning of this episode. So it would imply that the problem lies with Pinkie Pie, not with Gilda. And if the episode was about how Pinkie Pie had to learn to maybe give some personal space to other ponies that may need it, and accept that you don't have a monopoly over your friend's time, I think this episode could have actually still worked. Because the way Gilda retaliates comes off a lot more as if she's venting and not being actively malicious. Of course, the way Gilda went about it was terrible. There really is no defending that, but you can't really argue that Gilda's the possessive one of Rainbow Dash when Pinkie Pie's the one infringing first. Bear in mind, I don't have a problem with this episode tackling the moral that it wants to tackle, but the direction would have to be changed. Like, instead of Pinkie Pie trying to let herself in, I feel like this episode would be a lot more believable if it was Rainbow Dash making the effort to let Pinkie Pie into their fun. It honestly gives a lot of credit to what Twilight thinks in thinking that Pinkie Pie is just jealous of Gilda and Rainbow. Which is also a shame because later in this episode, it tries to portray Gilda as being this terrible person, but compared to what we saw earlier, something about it just feels like it doesn't match very well. Pinkie Pie's tone deafness aside, I think the episode did a decent job establishing Gilda as being a bad friend. If anything, I'm not even bothered by the fact that she had to tell Pinkie Pie to her face that Rainbow Dash doesn't need her anymore. Yes, there is that rule of storytelling that says show don't tell, but we the audience can see that Pinkie Pie is just really tone deaf. And she did try to send a hint to Pinkie Pie that she does not want to be bothered around her. To that end, I'm willing to give this episode a pass. Though, back to Twilight, it begs the question. How are you going to take the side of a total stranger and not one of your best friends? I mean, she's right until this episode wants to say that she was wrong, but still, it really feels like this episode understands this character flaw that Pinkie Pie has and just does not want to address it at all, which is honestly just a very confusing writing choice. As far as the scene that confirms Pinkie Pie's suspicions towards Gilda, there are several problems here as well. I do appreciate the fact that Pinkie Pie is trying to be the bigger mayor here and accept that maybe she was actually wrong the entire time, but it begs some questions. First off, how funny is a prank if the person getting pranked is not laughing along? And on that note, trying to scare the elderly? Are you trying to give her a heart attack or something? How is that supposed to be funny? You have to tell Rainbow Dash not to prank Fluttershy. I don't know why Granny Smith would be any different. Second of all, you see Gilda swipe an apple and eat it. How is she going to give it back? You could have had Gilda just hold off on eating that apple for a little bit longer so that Pinkie Pie could get that line out and it actually would make sense. It just feels like bad timing. Thirdly, we see Fluttershy run away crying from Gilda when she roars at her, and yet her face doesn't look like she's crying at all. Could the animators have not had her eyes be closed at the very least? It just completely destroys the immersion in this scene. But then we get into the third act, and this is where everything really comes to a boil. We see Pinkie Pie throw this party to Gilda to try and get her to be a better person. I guess that's the intent behind it. And what happens to Gilda is honestly a little sad. She looks to get targeted non-stop by pranks, which she assumes were from Pinkie Pie, someone whom she's been shown to have bad blood with, and we can also see was actually Pinkie Pie's fault too, who was also the first to deliberately prank Gilda, which would very clearly set her up to think that all of the pranks would come from her, considering this was her party as well. And at the end of it all, with everyone in the party also laughing at her expense mind you, she just snaps and goes off about how much she hated the party she was at. So, on one hand, I feel kind of bad for Gilda, but on the other hand, I kind of don't. Part of me thinks that her anger comes from the fact that she's venting about having a bad time at the party, and some of the pranks feel a little mean. Like getting her to put something spicy in her mouth and then having her try drinking some punch just to realize that the hole in the glass would make the punch fall out before it reaches her mouth. You could argue that Gilda shouldn't be able to take it, considering earlier in the episode, she said she could handle a good prank. But speaking personally, it just feels uncomfortable. And like, if the prank isn't appreciated, I think on one hand you should be willing to apologize for it because pranks aren't inherently funny. And unfriending Gilda after that lashing out just leaves a bad taste in my mouth too. This really feels like something that should be talked out rather than just completely abandoning her over it. Though on the other hand, she did try to prank Granny Smith, and you know, pranking the elderly is probably a bad idea in general, so I don't really know how bad it could really feel over Gilda being given that. What I am sure of though, I'm sure of not liking Pinkie Pie after this episode, because her character flaw of being invasive was acknowledged but not actually addressed, and the episode itself basically acts like she was right the entire time, which I could very easily see an argument against. Ultimately, I feel like I'm at an impasse here. Originally I called this episode okay, but I'm kind of leaning towards calling it a nightmare episode. But I at the same time don't know if I can really trust my own judgment, because it feels skewed hearing how many people think this episode's really bad. I guess the question I really want to ask then is, do I think the good in this episode's good enough to call it okay? I want to say yes, but then I feel like I'd be lying to you. I'm sorry, but as the facts stand, I just don't like Griffon the Brush Off. It's a nightmare episode. If the reveal of Gilda being a bad person was handled more organically, or if Pinkie Pie as a character actually grew from this story, I think I'd call it okay, but I'm just not a fan of how the writing was orchestrated here. Episode 6, Boast Busters! A boastful unicorn arrives in Ponyville, and Twilight's friends want to see her put in her place. This has to be one of the most cringe-worthy and boring episodes I've ever seen in this entire show. So much so I have almost no notes to really add to this episode because it was just not able to maintain my attention. Allow me to clarify. In the first 3 minutes, this episode already lost me. Trixie, the unicorn that comes to Ponyville, is established as being a braggart who was annoying to a lot of ponies, particularly Applejack, Rainbow Dash, and Rarity, in addition to Spike. Here's the problem though. Trixie's bragging is a part of her job. She's a street performer who performs magic tricks for an audience. For her to not brag, it would not be sustainable for her. And because she has to try and get your attention, literally all anyone would have to do if they wanted to not be bothered with Trixie is just to not pay attention to her. Really, just go away. Don't bother with Trixie. Don't pay attention to Trixie and she loses any power over you. Trying to show off a show-off by being a bigger show-off is just giving her what she wants. Except get this, she'd actually be in the right because all she's doing is playing to the crowd. That logic alone makes what Rarity, Applejack, and Rainbow Dash are trying to do entirely self-defeating. For this plot to make any sense, it would have to be a situation in which the main six and Spike would not be able to escape from. Like if, say, you were in school dealing with a bully. And even then, you're better off learning how to deal with people like Trixie instead of learning how to show people like her up. It's not worth it, do not do it. Outside of course, the extremely specific situations like in this episode where you have to use your talents. Which I will give this episode this, the moral itself is good, albeit how it's actually used is way too specific. Because when you get right down to it, magic's a big part of how Trixie is as well. You can't really say that this moral is okay for Twilight but not for Trixie, because by that same logic, it becomes hypocritical. It's actually a pretty similar blunder to Griffon The Brush Off, which basically just assumes that because the main six are the main six, they're in the right, even if they're the ones actually instigating the conflict. By the way, does anyone else find it strange how stage magic's supposed to be this impressive feat for a unicorn to pull off? I don't get it. 1/3 of the population of Ponyville can use magic. What makes Trixie so much more special? Wouldn't her tricks be more impressive if she was like a Pegasus or an Earth pony? God, even the world building's confused in this episode. Beyond that, what is there really to say about this episode? I think most of Twilight's friends act absolutely awful, namely the three I mentioned before and Spike. Funnily enough, Fluttershy and Pinkie Pie appear in this episode as well, but they have no real purpose in it. But of all the characters, Rainbow Dash by far is the absolute worst ever. She's honestly almost as haughty as Trixie is, except she treats it like a good thing until she's directly called out. And even as the goal to call Trixie a loudmouth at the end of the episode, even though we've seen in numerous occasions, even just this far into the show, how full of herself Rainbow is. There's also Snip, Snails, and Spike. They all suck. Spike's whole purpose in this story is just begging Twilight to do something that she very well can do, but doesn't want to do because she doesn't want her friends to hate her for it. And honestly, because her friends went against Trixie basically entirely unprovoked, it strongly implies that she's actually right. And it just goes on and on and on, and Spike just won't shut up. Snips and Snails are also just actively cringe. They have very annoying voices, and most of what they do is just suck up to Trixie. And Snails especially is portrayed as just being very stupid. I'd even say retarded, but I can't say that word in 2024. Which is just fantastic when there are so few male characters in this show as is, and the few we are seeing now are portrayed to be so much worse than the female ones. Yeah, regarding the story, there's not a good thing I can say about it. It's just a clear-cut nightmare episode. About the only thing good about this episode is the animation, in my opinion. The imagery especially thought was handled really well. Some notable examples are Rainbow Dash's trick in front of Trixie, the Ursa Minor and Major's designs, the whole process of lulling the Ursa Minor to sleep, even the alternating lights which are flickering on and off while Trixie's recounting how she managed an Ursa Major. I do like it a fair bit. Everything else though, nada. Actually, that's not true. I think Trixie's an interesting character and I like seeing her on the screen. If anything, I actually really like seeing her get back at the main six, particularly Rainbow Dash and Applejack. It was fun with Rarity too, but with her, it was unironic. Because with her, she actually had to get in Rarity's head, and she does it like a pro. It also just looks really good on Trixie that even though she's not able to banish the Ursa Minor, she does at least try to fix the problem. Which in all honesty is rather admirable about her. She's not the strongest, but she's not exactly a coward either. Though liking Trixie, and unironically considering I think that she's not really at fault, makes the ending actually a lot more sour, because at the end of the episode, she's the only one to really lose anything. Because the Ursa Minor that Snips and Snails led to Ponyville destroyed her wagon. And though this isn't Boast Busters' fault, but as we hear in a future episode in Magic Duel, Trixie's life became a lot harder when she was exposed for, I guess, being a fraud. Made no better by the fact that the actual punishment that Snips and Snails get isn't really a punishment at all, they're just given mustaches. A lame punishment for a lame ending to a really lame episode. I may not have much to say about it, but mark my words, there's very little to nothing good to say at all. Episode 7. Dragonshy. The main six are tasked with evicting a sleeping dragon. This episode is fantastic. I cannot say enough just how much I love this episode's story, the characterization, and even the continuity despite only being episode 7 in the show. But before talking about this episode, I just want to make a note. I like how this episode has Fluttershy feeding fish to ferrets, and then 4 seasons later in the Hooffields and the McCults, the ferrets are actually starving despite the fact that they're surrounded by their prey. But anyway, Dragonshy. There is a lot to love about this episode. Let's start with the characters. I think all of them were presented rather well here. For starters, this is the first episode where Pinkie Pie appears and where she's actually funny. And not just, like, at one point funny, but otherwise just kind of annoying. I mean, she's consistently funny throughout the entire episode. I think the part to get the hardest laugh out of me was when she tried to deal with the dragon herself, thinking she'd be able to get him to laugh. And then the dragon proceeds to beat the stuffing out of her with the sound effects and everything. I audibly laughed out loud because of just how well timed the joke was. I also just have to give a lot of props to Rarity, who is consistently really fun throughout this entire episode too. She doesn't have as much impact on the actual plot, but I definitely did not mind her here at all. The other members of the main six were handled pretty well too, namely Twilight and Applejack. Though speaking of Applejack, I think she represents loyalty a lot more than Rainbow Dash does, just from seeing how much harder she's working to keep Fluttershy with the rest of the pack. I guess if you wanted to get technical, you wouldn't really need Applejack to carry Fluttershy up the mountain. If Twilight can levitate a Ursa Minor, she could very easily do that with Fluttershy too, which would be optimal considering this is a time-sensitive issue. But to be frank, I like the approach this episode made more. I have to admit as well, seeing Applejack drag Fluttershy up the mountain with her tail tied around her head, that also got a good laugh out of me. Also, her performance in that avalanche scene is absolutely top-notch, and it really sells just how trustworthy she is if Twilight was actually going to die before Applejack went to rescue her. That's another thing, this episode has really good action in it. Of course, ignore the fact that it's a kid's cartoon, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to actually die in it. But still, there were some surprisingly close shaves, and also seeing Rainbow Dash doing her little Star Fox flying during the avalanche was also really cool. But I appreciate that the main six are going through some actual dangerous situations. It's not just this extremely saccharine slop. And it really sells just how high the stakes really are in this story. Though on the note of loyalty, you could maybe debate Rainbow Dash, but I don't actually have a problem with her in this episode, since a lot of her gripes come down to the fact that Fluttershy is making the journey harder for everyone else. And in that sense, it's actually very understandable where she's actually coming from. Because even though Rainbow Dash wants to resolve this issue as quickly as possible, she's also willing to actually listen to reason. I'm not even really bothered by her seeming like a loyalty to Fluttershy. As a character, I can't buy that she's just really impatient. And the episode doesn't make it too callous on her end, mostly because of Pinkie Pie lightening the mood a lot with her presence. Like this seemingly tiny gap which Fluttershy could very easily fly over, doesn't even have to really jump. But then you have Pinkie Pie and Earth Pony repeatedly jump over the gap to give Fluttershy the courage to actually make the leap herself. It's a great showcase for how uplifting Pinkie Pie can be even in really dark times for other ponies. But also, it's just great to see that the main six are actually bouncing off of each other. It's not just Twilight like in the pilot. You have Rainbow Dash bouncing off of Applejack. You have Rarity bouncing off of Pinkie Pie. You have Fluttershy bouncing off of Rainbow Dash. There's just so many opportunities being taken in this episode for characters to interact with each other. And by the end of it all, when it seems like the main six can't deal with the dragon at all, like Twilight predicted, it would be Fluttershy who's best with animals being able to actually save the day. Which is especially impressive considering that it's established in this episode that Fluttershy has a phobia of dragons. Particularly grown-up ones. Which, by the way, thank you for this episode actually addressing this otherwise plot hole with the fact that she's not afraid of Spike or even Manticores, because Manticores aren't dragons and Spike's a baby, so I guess he would not be very threatening. I'm just happy it's been acknowledged at all. I also really like this hidden layer to Fluttershy's personality that while she has a very hard time really standing up for herself, she has this inner strength that's plenty willing to go to bat for others if they are in danger. Which she puts on full display when the dragon pushes around her friends, and she stands up to him and even pushes him to tears, which is, might I also just say, one of the rawest moments in this entire show so far. To be honest, up to this point, I was afraid that maybe just season 1 would take a lot longer to actually start getting good. But no, Dragonshy is honest to god a good episode. A great showcase of the characters, a great adventure all around. It has a good moral about believing in your friends, and an overall just fantastic execution. I'm actually mighty impressed. Episode 8. Look before you sleep. Rarity and Applejack must survive each other's presence while trapped at Twilight's. So, I'll be frank, I have no idea where to start with my problems with this episode. Honestly, it feels like I'm watching an entirely different cartoon. Rarity and Applejack basically act as bitter enemies in this episode despite being best friends in the show itself. And therein lies the problem, because it feels like this episode forgets the fact that they are, or at least were, good friends. I get that, of course, best friends can still fight, and that would include getting angry with each other. But the stuff they're fighting over is just so petty. It'd be okay if they were just fillies, like little children, but they're fully grown mares with their own businesses. What I'm driving at is that this episode has both Applejack and Rarity act ridiculously out of character throughout the entire thing. Not to mention being considerably less intelligent than we've seen in the show prior. Okay, one, what is Rarity doing out pruning trees with the rest of the ponies before the storm comes along? where her efforts are actually just spent putting branches back on the trees and trying to decorate them? Isn't she a seamstress? What's she doing outside performing labor with the rest of them? Later in the episode, she shows a very clear aversion to getting dirty. What is she doing out earlier then? I'd maybe understand if we saw more of the main six out and about helping with the project, but the only other pony we see this early in the episode is Applejack. I can understand to an extent why we don't see Fluttershy or Rainbow Dash. They're Pegasi, so they can out with the clouds up in the sky. And apparently Twilight's house was only a few yards away from where Applejack and Rarity were working. But like, what about Pinkie Pie? Assuming this would be a community effort, which is the only reason I could possibly see for Rarity being here at all, I'd then expect pretty much all of the main six to be out and about helping. Worst case scenario, I would much sooner believe that Pinkie Pie would be helping out here rather than Rarity would be. And it goes without saying, but what are you doing putting branches back on trees? You're not stupid, Rarity. And in doing this, you have absolutely no legs to stand on arguing with Applejack. It's entirely senseless. 2. On the note of both Rarity and Applejack being grown mares, the premise for this episode is that Rarity and Applejack are trying to endure each other while at Twilight's house for a slumber party. And they both make it a point to say that they don't want to ruin the party for Twilight, so they would both basically have a truce to basically behave themselves just to make Twilight happy. Okay, so given that, shouldn't you two try to be a little more careful to not tip Twilight off? I think this episode would be a lot better if Rarity and Applejack were trying to be more careful and not really alerting Twilight to the fact that they're actually fighting. Like if it wasn't so obvious that they were trying to irk each other. Because the way Rarity and Applejack are portrayed in this episode, it makes absolutely no sense for Twilight to be so oblivious to the entire thing. There are some scenes with merit, like the s'mores where Applejack just scarfs them down while Rarity is more about presentation being important. But a lot of this episode is spent with them trying to antagonize each other. They don't come off as friends, they come off as if they just actively hate each other. As a result, it feels like there's a lot of untapped potential for tension in this story, instead of Applejack and Rarity getting progressively more annoyed with each other, which would naturally come about because they choose to present themselves differently. It all basically boils down to just one joke. Rarity being a neat freak, and Applejack being a slob. But I think what gets me the most is just 3. Twilight. Does anyone else find it funny how this pony who's been an introvert basically her entire life as far as we know, that had friends back in Canterlot she really did not want much to do with at all? I mean, if Moon Dancer's anyone to go by. Always wanted a slumber party? Originally I bought this because even introverts want to hang out with others and close friends every now and then. And she was there for Gilda's welcoming parties, so of course she's not openly opposed to them. The problem though is that Twilight's character for the longest time has been set on not caring about friends at all until she came to Ponyville. I almost wonder what this plot would be like if it was Pinkie Pie and not Twilight. I mean, I guess you lose some of the more neurotic moments of Twilight, but I don't know how much I'd actually miss them either. Whenever Twilight takes a break from the plot to check up on her book to check something off, all it really does is just break the flow for me. As a result, moments that would be funny in this episode just aren't. It doesn't help either that a slumber party is just not inherently interesting. I don't know, if you treat them like an angry old couple, maybe you find this funnier, but I really am just more confused than anything else. It also just looks really bad on Twilight to see her friends just argue with each other and not do anything to stop it, at least until she's trying to sleep. She really is just a mess in this episode. So much so that when Applejack brings the tree into her house, all she can think about is the fact that the book says nothing about the tree being in the house. I don't get it. Is the joke the fact that Twilight's an idiot here, or that she's just so neurologically disabled that she literally cannot process information without being told what to do because of a book? I think that really sums up my biggest problem with this episode though. There are no characters. Literally everyone in this story acts like a joke. And if you don't find it funny, you're not gonna find this episode funny. And the issues that Applejack and Rarity have with each other are so absolutely inconsequential, like these are some grade A nothing burgers. I really just cannot get invested in the drama. Negativity aside, there are some positive aspects to the story at least. Applejack and Rarity is a pretty unique pairing, and seeing these two bounce off of each other and develop each other can make for an interesting story. It's unfortunately cancelled out by just how repetitive this episode's story actually is, but at least the ending is pretty good. Where Applejack manages to reach Rarity by appealing to her senses first before she can help her. At least until Twilight completely breaks the flow of it. Y'all should already know this, but this is a bona fide nightmare. If there was ever a story I would just sum up as stuff happens the episode, this would absolutely be it. No characters, no structure, no progression, no anything. Like a Generation 3 short film that suck us away into Generation 4. No more of this, please. Episode 9, Bridle Gossip. A resident of the Evergreen Forest arises superstition amongst the Ponyville public. Let's just ask this question. Should we start with the good or the bad? You probably want to hear the good first, since it sounds better on the cover. But no, I think it's really important we start with the bad first. So starting with that, let's begin with the characterization. It is awful. I'm not particularly opposed to the main six being prejudiced against others, but it makes no sense that only Twilight is willing to have an open mind here at all, considering that shying away from strangers is literally the polar opposite of what Pinkie Pie is all about. And I don't buy that she'd buy into superstitions either. Pinkie Pie is nothing if she's not accommodating. She's someone that's excited to meet new people, not someone to shy away from them. That's more so a Fluttershy thing, if anything. There's also very strong evidence in the pilot to suggest that Pinkie Pie would sooner laugh in the face of danger rather than run away from it. It's inconceivable that Pinkie Pie would, alongside the rest of her friends, just shy away from having any kind of contact with Sakura. And this kind of paranoia could not have just happened recently either. Rainbow Dash recounts that Sakura arrives in Ponyville once a month. For Twilight to not know who Sakura actually is, it would mean that she must not have been here for that long. No matter how you slice it, Pinkie Pie has zero excuse for her behavior in this episode. Already a bad start, to say nothing of the fact that Applejack is generally the most level-headed of the main six, and like Pinkie Pie, feels out of character for believing in something that she should know better does not exist. And the sad thing is that this episode only gets worse from here. It's predicated on the idea that Sakura really isn't a bad person and is not really a danger to any pony else. But the episode also really wants to sell on you that she really is a danger before you get to really know her. They give her glowing yellow eyes, a color commonly linked to danger and caution. Her natural eye color isn't even yellow, it's like a dark mix of green and blue. She constantly speaks in rhymes, which is commonly linked to incantations. And she wears a hood for no discernible reason, considering that most ponies typically don't wear clothes at all. And if you don't understand how that can be confused as being evil, oftentimes being under shadows and in the dark can be associated with evil. It's like when watching The Lion King and you see Scar under the shadows. Or if you've ever seen Shaolin Showdown, it's like when Raymundo has his hood up, which he's only ever done when he joined the evil side. It's a way of communicating alignment without dialogue. And bear in mind, absolutely none of these three things were ever explained. Even trying to give this episode the benefit of the doubt, like saying maybe Sakura is only wearing that hood because it's hot out because the sun is out and she's trying to get out of the sun. After all, Twilight and Spike did comment on how the sky is entirely clear of clouds. Sakura's behavior of rhyming everything she says is still highly unusual. And granted, even though that in and of itself isn't really a telltale sign of any kind of danger, it still would not really be fair to say others have a prejudiced view of her by calling her an evil enchantress because of how she presents herself. You have to admit that Sakura looks shady, especially when again, she has glowing yellow eyes. They say the eyes are a window into the soul. If Sakura's natural eye color was yellow, then that would be one thing. That's something she would not be able to control. But sadly, that's not the case. It all feels pretty cheap. Like, you really cannot blame someone for being skeptical by also putting on all these signs that would say that you should stay away from them. While the moral of not judging a book by its cover is good, the way this episode tries to communicate that moral is entirely wrong. The way this moral is typically delivered is basically talking about not judging somebody for things they can't control, like being black or being a girl, or feeling that maybe you just look really bad because of something that happened to you, not because of something you did to yourself. An excellent example actually comes from Toy Story. If you know that film, you'll remember that Sid used to do some really screwed up stuff to his toys, including creating these aesthetically unholy abominations from actively taking his toys apart. But the film goes on to show that the toys themselves still mean well. From the moment we, the audience, see Woody trying to get the toys off of Buzz, even though they're responsible for putting his arm back on him, it managed to effectively communicate you should not be judging them for looking the way they do because they're not bad. And this gets into why Bridle Gossip really fails in its storytelling. Why would you tell someone not to judge a book by its cover when the very same book is actively trying to hide itself? All that hood did for Sakura was make her look worse for no good reason. As if you're trying to gaslight your viewers into thinking that someone's a lot worse than they actually are. In which case, you can't shame someone for believing something that you led them to believe through no fault of their own. Especially when near the end of the episode, even Twilight is led to believe that Zecora is evil. This episode's moral would make a lot more sense if it didn't try going so overboard with trying to make Zecora look suspicious. The fact that Zecora is a zebra, an entirely different species from ponies, should be enough anyway. You really don't need the hood, particularly when ponies typically don't wear clothes. That alone would have helped the subtlety a lot. Or if at the very least, we saw her do something good before it was unveiled that she was ever a bad person. The episode does try to do that with Zecora warning the main six about the poison joke, but it's undermined by what should be common sense. Like I said before, the fact that Zecora rhymes everything she says and there's never an explanation given for that does a massive disservice to her credibility. To say nothing of the fact that that's the first time we hear Zecora say anything in this entire episode, and as a result, we're being led to believe that there's more credit being given to the main six minus Twilight. And given the environment everyone was in, I imagine there had to be a better way to communicate Zecora not being evil. Like, for God's sake, what happened to the main six happened in the Everfree Forest. We've seen how dangerous that place was in the pilot. Comparatively speaking, there's virtually no danger in this area at all in this episode. Why couldn't we have seen, like, Zecora threw something in Applebloom's general direction, but it hit a creature in the Everfree Forest that would have been an immediate danger to Applebloom? Call it cliche, but at least I could see an attempt then for trying to say that Zecora had Applebloom's best interest at heart the entire time. Though while in the Everfree Forest, there's a massive continuity error here. As Zecora is giving her warning to the main six in Applebloom about the poison joke, there are several shots showing where Applebloom is standing, and there's just nothing but grass underneath her. But the moment the main six actually catch up to Applebloom, all of a sudden in the very next shot, there's poison joke beneath Applebloom and Applejack. And yet with the main six, Applebloom is the only pony not to be affected by it at all. Then there's also the question of just how consistent the effect of the curse actually even is. Twilight recounts how Zecora ruined her horn, even though she's shown no trouble using magic with it. I mean, she did as much to brush her hair, and outside of comedy reasons, which to be fair, it is pretty funny. I don't know why Rainbow Dash doesn't just run everywhere, considering that she can just stand still just fine. She does as much when the main six actually confronts Zecora after all. That's just a nitpick, but I'm already completely lost on the plot, so I can't help but just want to pick this plot apart now. Finally, when she's preparing the remedy for Applebloom for the bubble bath for the main six to get cured of their poison joke, why does she stick her tongue inside to check the temperature? If the contents ended up being too hot, wouldn't that burn her tongue? It's funny because at the same time, Twilight and company are actually under the pretense that she's gonna cook Applebloom with that cauldron. Her dialogue alone would suggest that she had it planned for Applebloom. You didn't need her to freaking taste test it. Just have her put her hoof inside the cauldron to check the temperature. It's amazing how far this episode wants to go to make us think that Zecora is bad. But yeah, that's a massive problem I have with this episode. It feels manipulative. Outside of that, there are elements of this episode that I do like, but in general, I have absolutely no shame in calling this a nightmare episode. Now, as for the good, I like Spike in this episode a lot. I find his antics to generally be really funny. Like, he could be heading into the kitchen to get a snack as Applejack is saying the Everfree Forest, and as she finishes saying it, he makes a mess as if there's like makeshift thunder happening outside. That was good. I also find it cute when Rainbow Dash taunts Twilight about her horn and magic, considering she's the biggest skeptic about the supernatural, and everyone knows that Twilight's just full of it trying to explain it away, because at their core, curses and magic really are one and the same. Also for the record, Twilight does not know what the word supernatural actually means. Paranormal is what you call stuff like zombies and ghosts. Supernaturals, like magic in the world of Friendship is Magic, are things you simply cannot explain, but you know are very much real. So her rejecting that book that Spike brought to her was based off of false information. Again, I'm nitpicking. And besides, supernatural and paranormal as words are very, very similar anyway. It's just that paranormal is much more often linked to the occult, and dismissing a book for being titled Supernaturals is actually hypocritical on Twilight's part. Spike's reaction to the cursed main six was also pretty funny. I especially love when he was trying to come up with big names for the main six, and yet nothing could come to mind for Twilight at all. And he's just looking at the camera acting as if, well, I don't know what to call her, what do you think? He's just really been on a roll in this episode. Not enough to save it from being a nightmare, but at least there's one thing about this episode I actually really liked about it. By the way, unlike Griffon The Brush Off, this episode I actually did call good in my original review. Ain't it funny how time makes fools of us all? Though, unlike Griffon The Brush Off, even amidst the absolutely catastrophic failure of the writing here, I do kind of appreciate the fact that the main six acknowledged they were wrong about Zecora the entire time. Maybe because not too long ago I already saw both Boast Busters and Griffon The Brush Off, but I just really appreciate seeing the main six have their egos be shot down for once. Oh yeah, I guess Fluttershy's Flutter Guy voice was pretty funny too. To be honest, when you know the twist, it kinda loses its luster, I'm sorry to say that. Seriously though, Rainbow Crash is way funnier. On an unrelated note, imagine if this show did adult judge a book by its cover moral, with someone that appears at first to be good, but ends up actually being Oh yeah, Canterlot Wedding exists. Episode 10, Swarm of the Century! An infestation of parasprites causes havoc, leaving the main six to scramble and clean it up. Wow. So this is the first episode I feel legitimately conflicted on. On one hand, I think this episode is actually decently fun. On the other hand, the moral has been, for lack of a better phrase, horribly delivered. In case you're wondering, the moral is about how you should listen to your friends' opinions and perspectives, even if they don't necessarily make sense. In relation to the fact that Pinkie Pie knew the answer to how to deal with the parasprites all along, and had her friends just listen to her, they could have had this problem solved way more quickly. Unfortunately, with that moral comes a massive plot hole. Pinkie Pie made virtually no real attempt to communicate what she was actually trying to do. She alludes to knowing about the parasprites and not liking them, and shortly after learning they were in Ponyville, she started looking for instruments. Now this on its own isn't really the worst thing in the world. There's virtually no correlation between the two, but you could argue that Twilight and her friends could have actually reasoned that maybe Pinkie Pie knew more than she was letting on. In which case, sure, they should have tried to reach out to Pinkie Pie for help. The problem though, is that Fluttershy point blank asks Pinkie Pie how she could not like them. And Pinkie Pie just completely ignores her question and goes to do her own thing. That early on, Pinkie Pie lost pretty much any excuse to not just tell her friends what she was doing, why she was doing it, and why it would work. It doesn't even matter that only Twilight and Fluttershy were there for the question to be asked. If she wouldn't answer Fluttershy there, why would she answer Rainbow Dash, Rarity, or Applejack at that point? It makes the behavior of the main six to dismiss Pinkie Pie and everything she's trying to do entirely reasonable. For this to work, Pinkie Pie would have to actually explain how what she's trying to do would actually work. If the main six were actually let in on what Pinkie Pie was trying to do and her thought process behind it, and they instead just decided they were not going to do it because it did not make sense to them, then fine, this episode would actually make perfect sense. You can't do a moral like this with having Pinkie Pie be purposefully cryptic. And that right there is the biggest problem with this episode. Good moral, garbage execution. There's another, albeit much smaller problem with the fact that Fluttershy keeps one of the parasprites around after learning they're kind of a danger to everyone else. But honestly, I think this criticism is massively overblown. The parasprites on their own don't really travel very far, and honestly, I suspect that only Fluttershy would really be suffering at all from having them around her cottage. If she wants to suffer a pest infestation, let that be her burden to carry. After all, it's still Pinkie Pie's fault, and entirely Pinkie Pie's fault, that the parasprites got to Ponyville at all. Though it also makes me suspect that maybe this episode was originally 11 minutes long, because how the main five had all their work undone because of Fluttershy makes this scene look entirely pointless. Honestly, the only saving grace for this episode is the humor and some of the world building. This episode makes Pinkie and especially Rainbow Dash look really cool, particularly the scenes where you see Rainbow Dash make a tornado to scoop the parasprites up. You gotta hand it to Lauren, she gave these ponies some really cool skills. The humor in this episode is also pretty decent. I think it's really funny when Twilight's inspecting Ponyville for when Princess Celestia is going to be visiting, and she sees this sign that says, "Welcome Princess Celeste." And it's not the fact that the sign's written in pink crayon, it's not the fact that its presentation looks sloppy with pink splotches underneath the text. It's not even the fact that the capitalization is inconsistent. No, her only problem is just the fact that it doesn't fit the entire phrase, "Welcome Princess Celestia." Yeah, that was funny. The little Doom vision where Twilight imagines the parasprites eating Princess Celestia is also pretty funny. And there's a few cute visual gags to do with the parasprites too. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but Applejack's voice sounds a little different in this episode, like the voice she has throughout the rest of the show. Her voice before now sounded softer almost. This really has nothing to do with the quality of the episode. I'm just really trying to rack my brain for good stuff to say about it. Meanwhile, I could also point out the fact that this episode introduces Ikora for no discernible reason. Twilight takes the parrot right to her, and all she can really just say is that, yeah, you're doomed. Like, what's the point of that? Was the episode a minute too short? If it was, you could have easily filled that time in with just having Pinkie Pie actually explain what she was trying to do. Or heck, have Ikora actually know the solution to the Paris Sprite so that at least there's a bit of foreshadowing for Pinkie Pie. I want to be nice and call this episode okay, but unlike the Ticketmaster, which I can find at least somewhat excusable, there really is just no excusing Pinkie Pie's behavior and actions here. And I'm sorry, this episode is not funny enough for me not to call it a nightmare episode. Pinkie, either gain some social awareness, or failing that, just be genuinely funny. Right now you're failing to do both. Episode 11, Winter Wrap-Up. It's Winter Wrap-Up Day in Ponyville, and Twilight wants to do her part and help the cause. Before talking about this episode's story, I just want to take the time to admire this episode's song. It's catchy, it's cinematic, it does a lot of heavy lifting for storytelling too, and it's quite a cut above any other song that happened earlier in the show. And through it, we're being given exposition as far as what everyone actually does during Winter Wrap-Up, and Twilight's goal throughout the episode. A great start for an otherwise really average episode of My Little Pony. And when I say average, I mean at worst, this episode is average. There are some elements of this episode I find rather questionable, like the fact that it's tradition that the ponies in Ponyville don't use magic, even though later it's established that Ponyville is routinely late for Winter Wrap-Up to happen too. An interesting plot point, the one that actually works against the story. I feel like most reasonable people would be able to understand how tradition can oftentimes be counterproductive if a smarter way to work is available to you and you don't take advantage of it. With that in mind, Spike's making a lot of sense when he's just telling Twilight to use magic to make things go more smoothly. It's even more questionable when you consider the fact that Mayor Mare mentions that because Ponyville is routinely late for Winter Wrap-Up, it brings scandal and shame to the town. Given that, you'd think the resolution would basically be to adopt Applebuck Season's approach, and accept you can't manage the situation the way things are going as is. That being said, I'm not going to harp on this too much in this episode, because there's an episode in Season 2 where this becomes much, much worse. And it is like the traditional way doesn't work in this episode either. It was really just the issue of organization. Besides, it's cool to be old school, unless of course there's competition actively stamping you out. Which this episode, to be fair, doesn't have that issue with. That aside, there were some moments that I thought were pretty funny. In particular, I like the scenes where Twilight's trying to help Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack. They were all pretty fun. Though something about the slapstick involving Twilight licking up animals just was not doing it for me. I guess I just don't really find it funny when I see Twilight trying to do her best to do something good, and she just gets hurt for it. At that point, I just feel kinda bad for her. And not in the sense of I just really want to see her find her place in this whole organization. It's more that I feel bad and it's just depressing. It doesn't help either that as far as moral support is concerned, Spike's not offering it. Ironically, I think Pinkie Pie does a much better job in that department, and she barely appears in this episode. There's also the question of why Spike does so little in this episode. He's a dragon that can breathe fire. You'd think he'd be tailor-made to melt snow and ice in record time. The episode may object to unicorn magic, but not dragon fire. Though then again, this may be one of those details that literally only I care about. At the end of the day though, this episode's decent. Not quite what I'd call good, but I think it's very much okay. By the way, did you know that Friendship is Magic originally had the EI symbol in the top right corner of the screen in this show? It's funny, because the educational moment where Fluttershy explaining what hibernation is the only time I can ever think of this show actually trying to be educational. And that's actually kind of hilarious. Episode 12, Call of the Cutie. Applebuck is desperate to get a cutie mark. There's a lot to be said when one of my favorite Season 1 episodes barely involves Twilight at all. I suppose I should preface this by saying I am aware that Twilight has to appear in every episode in Season 1, mainly because of corporate mandates, and it's because only she can really send letters to Princess Celestia. The only other episode so far in Season 1 I can think of that really tried to minimize Twilight's involvement in it was probably Griffon The Brush Off. And even then, I think Call of the Cutie was a lot more natural with it. She appears pretty late, and it's really only to try and fulfill an idea that Applebuck had to get a cutie mark. Given that, it's really impressive how the writer for this episode was able to make it so that Twilight had very little involvement and have it not be forcibly rewritten. Talking more about the episode itself though, it's a very fun episode. Applebuck is just adorable, and her fervent desire to get a cutie mark leads to a lot of really good comedy, from extorting customers and trying to sell apples, to the various activities she does with Rainbow Dash trying to get a cutie mark early. It's all just really fun to watch. I like also how this episode goes through the trouble of explaining how magic isn't going to help Applebuck with her problem. Speaking of her problem though, I guess now is a fair time to mention Diamond Tiara and not really having anything positive to say about her either. Her teasing for the most part is just whatever, I honestly could not care less. If anything, all it really does is make me care about Applebuck even more. But it's so strange seeing that there's so many ponies that can see Applebuck being bullied by these two fillies and not really think anything of it, even when some moments are unfortunately very, accurate to real life, let's just say that. Yes, Charlie, just walk away and let one of your students get bullied by this rich kid and her friend. It's just sad to see sometimes. The one aside note, this has got to be the one and only show where it's appropriate to see kids shake their butts in public. I'm not trying to be perverted either, that's literally what Silver Spoon is doing at the beginning of the episode. But I digress. Another fun part of this episode is when Applebuck is trying to bake cupcakes with Pinkie Pie, and the cupcakes themselves look black as charcoal, and Pinkie Pie has like no reaction that's not just purely positive seeing them. And she not only eats them like they're nothing, but she's also serving them to other ponies at the quinceañera that Diamond Tiara is having. Which is also just really funny to think that Diamond Tiara's party is going to be so much worse as a result, considering you've got ponies drinking out of the punch bowl, you have cupcakes that taste like rocks, and then funnily enough, we have an actually good moment from Snails where he takes a massive bite out of Diamond Tiara's cake, and that ends up upsetting her too. I also like when Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon actually find Applebuck at her party, and Applebuck actually attempts to scare Diamond Tiara into not showing her the lack of the cutie mark that she has. And it actually works, and she looks legitimately terrified by the idea of being upstaged at her own party. I think that's a big part of why I don't really mind Diamond Tiara too much in this episode. Applebuck may be vulnerable, but she's also really savvy and smart. And safe to say, it's really fun seeing Diamond Tiara squirm. Though I feel like I may be repeating myself saying fun a lot in this review. Something that really hit close to home with me though is the moral. Because it's true, as a kid, often what you want is just to fit in with your peers. Not really realizing that just because you're different doesn't mean there's anything really wrong with you. And it makes the ending really sweet, seeing Applebuck make two friends with Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo. The latter, by the way, dropped a hot diss on Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon, calling them stuck up. And I audibly went, oh, because that was just such a sick burn. Speaking of these two though, this episode got a laugh out of me really quickly in the beginning, where you can see ponies that look really similar to Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo, maybe not in color, but they're anatomically very similar. The only real difference is that the Scootaloo recolor was an earth pony, which, time to think of it, Scootaloo can't fly. Huh. And the recolors themselves are just so shameless, I could not help but laugh at it. There's other stuff I found unintentionally funny, like Bonbon's voice when Applebuck dumps apples in her bags. She sounds a little hoarse if you catch my drift. Like, it's just so bad it's good. Not like this episode though, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. It's a good episode. A great start for the Cutie Mark Crusaders, and dare I say it, another really fun episode in general. Episode 13. Fall Weather Friends. Applejack and Rainbow Dash compete to see who's the better athlete. So I like this episode, and I think there's a lot to like about it as well. I think the pairing of Rainbow Dash and Applejack is actually a very cool one to see in the show. We've seen hints of the rivalry back at the Ticketmaster, but this is the first episode I feel like that really puts it on full display. And the ways these two do compete, I think is actually handled pretty creatively. I like the variety of events in the Iron Pony competition. Testing buck strength, throwing hay bales, dashing through barrels. Some I would say are a little samey, like the previously mentioned buck strength, but you also see Rainbow Dash and Applejack bucking footballs. But overall, there's a very good flow to this part of the episode, and it's really enjoyable to see. The way Applejack and Rainbow Dash are characterized here also feels very organic. It doesn't feel like it's really forced for the plot to actually function like Look Before You Sleep. Rather, it really just feels like it's all in good fun. You do see hints that maybe Rainbow Dash in particular is taking it a lot more seriously than she probably should be, but by now in the show, it's well substantiated that she's very competitive. I can't even get mad at her for using her wings to her advantage. I mean, sure, it's not necessarily fair to Applejack, but not taking advantage of what's unique to you does not make any sense if you're thinking practically. You play to win, and I respect that. It's also interesting to see that even though Applejack is by and large stronger than Rainbow Dash, Rainbow still has her licked in hoof wrestling. But yeah, it's overall a fantastic start to the episode, building in the rivalry between these two, and also giving Applejack a decent cause for complaint seeing wings being used against her. And just to throw this bias out of here, seeing Fluttershy as a scorekeeper is freaking adorable. The main event with the running of the leaves, though, I do think is a little less enjoyable. I do like seeing Spike and Pinkie Pie bounce off of each other a lot. There is also the fairly beautiful environment, seeing all these oranges and browns for the fall season. I tend to not talk about visuals that much, but I think it looks really cool. But the actual running between Applejack and Rainbow Dash with Twilight in the background is a little obnoxious. Everything between Applejack and Rainbow Dash is pretty good if you ask me. And there's even a closer version of their elements, seeing Applejack hitch a ride on the hot air balloon to get back into the race, despite representing honesty, implying that you wouldn't cheat, and Rainbow Dash going back on her word about having a good clean race, using dirty tricks to slow Applejack down, throw her off course, or just bolt ahead. In effect, displaying a lack of loyalty. Though I must say, the fact that Applejack hitched a ride on the hot air balloon and got to the front of the pack, after that, in my mind, Rainbow Dash won this competition, because there's no freaking way that's not illegal in some way, shape, or form. Not a complaint though, it's just what I think would be fair. What is a complaint though has to be with Twilight. So I see what the writer wanted to do with her, considering that she's basically the voice of reason, seeing what actually happens and making sure that the others are aware of it. And I do think the writer did a good job introducing her into this part of the episode. Where things go sour for me, however, is just that Twilight feels self-righteous. I can understand being the voice of reason and recognizing when foul play has actually happened, where it actually hasn't yet from what she could have seen, but making comments about how you should have looked where you were going like I was just rubs me the wrong way. It makes her come off more as a smart aleck rather than someone that's actually knowledgeable about running, when her just being purely neutral would have been enough to get the point across. If she had less of this holier-than-thou attitude where it really isn't warranted, quite honestly, this episode will be darn near perfect. I'm not even really bothered by the fact that Twilight came in 5th place out of presumably at least 42 other participants, because the real takeaway here is just the fact that Twilight managed to place above Rainbow Dash and Applejack at all, not that she ranked high. Nonetheless, this episode then ends with a really cute moral about how friendship should not be more important than competition, which is a solid end to what I call a good episode. Oh, and here's the challenge for you watching back at home. Try to count all the duplicate ponies and numbers just before and as the race actually starts. Trust me, that will keep you busy for a while. Episode 14. Suited for Success. Rarity runs herself ragged sewing dresses for her friends. It's hard to believe that this episode was written by the same person who wrote Look Before You Sleep, because by comparison, Suited for Success is a much better polished, much better structured, and much more entertaining episode. All the while, like Griffon The Brush Off, not really including Twilight too much in the story. No, this episode has a very clear focus on Rarity, and for the first episode that's solely focused on her, I really like what this episode actually does. There's a very clear focus on the fact that Rarity represents generosity, with her volunteering herself to make 5 whole new dresses for her friends, plus 1 for herself, the motivation being it be for the Grand Galloping Gala. Which of course makes plenty of sense, and honestly it's kind of strange how it's only now we've been getting a follow-up to the Ticketmaster, so the structure is very clearly all there. As for the writing though, this episode feels like friendship is magic when it's in its absolute most pure form. The moral itself is a very strong one, in that if you try to please everybody, you'll end up pleasing no one, including yourself. To say nothing of the fact that when it comes to sewing dresses, it's Rarity's element. She'd know better than anyone else what actually would look good. And trying to honor every whim of the customer may end up giving you something that would look terrible to you, and to them, which is actually a really funny interpretation of this lesson, while Rarity's friends learn the importance of not looking a gift horse in the mouth. I could maybe see some wondering whether or not they already knew this lesson by the fact that the main 5 do try to avoid hurting Rarity's feelings early on, but at the same time, their facial expressions and the inflections in their voice really gives the vibe that what they see they're not necessarily in love with. Even though there was nothing really wrong with the dresses, it's still true that it wasn't exactly what they would consider to be perfect. But therein lies the problem. You can't really expect perfection from somebody who is not going to be able to read your mind and make something exactly the way you think it should look. I'm not going to say you should be satisfied with just anything, but when something clearly involves a lot of love and care into actually making it, not to mention you're giving it for free, it really would be for the best to be grateful for what you're given. Or at the very least, show some respect for the fact that you were given a gift in the first place. You gotta keep in mind, while Rarity's friends are trying to dance around how they actually felt about the dresses, That doesn't necessarily mean they knew this moral ahead of time either. There were no signs of actual gratitude at the time, there was no thank you or anything like that. So I think it is fair to say that this is a lesson they had to learn. And back on the note of this episode being Friendship is Magic in its purest form, I really like how this episode largely just focuses on the main six and how they interact with each other. It keeps things simple and down to earth, it's really comfy to watch. And the morals themselves tend to be better geared towards your friends and not, say, managing a business or trying to maintain good public relations between different ambassadors in their countries. The stakes don't have to be massively high in the show. To be fair, in this episode, there are some pretty high stakes because of Rarity's reputation being in jeopardy after the fashion show, but what makes it actually work for me is just how much more personal it feels. It's not like, say, Equestria will be invaded by changelings because their dresses just are too ugly. No, it's as simple as Rarity's reputation has been ruined, and her friends want to restore it. It's honestly perfect. Something else about this episode I really like is the song. Like with the wrap up, the song of this episode is an absolute earworm. Not only is the melody beautiful, but it also does a lot of heavy lifting in explaining Rarity's thought process behind sewing the dresses for her friends. And it exclaims just how much thought she really put into every little detail, which also leads us to Rarity's friends actually. It's interesting how they're all characterized regarding when they don't really appreciate the dresses that Rarity made for them. And more than that, how they perceive what would be the best way to make their dresses as well. Twilight's way too focused on accuracy and not enough on how much is actually too much. Pinkie Pie will just think of anything and say, oh yeah, put that on. Rainbow Dash is someone who will only know what she likes when she sees it. Fluttershy has a lot of critiques that make it sound as if she knows what she's talking about, but she really doesn't. Even though she has some expertise in sewing, she clearly has less than Rarity does. And Applejack just completely lost the plot and forgot the fact that they're going to a gala, having things like overalls and goulashes on her dress. It all boils down to thinking too much about what makes it unique to you, rather than thinking about aesthetic design actually being there. Though on the note of Applejack, it's really sad how she forgot this lesson in this episode, because a lot of the mistakes she made in this episode she verbatim makes an honest apple, thinking way too much about practicality in the wrong sense. I guess if there was anything else to say about this episode, I like a lot of the visual humor in it as well. Especially when it involves Opal. She's actually really funny in how she reacts to the dresses in this episode. Like looking at Applejack's work does, and then she looks like she's about to gag. It's also really funny seeing Fluttershy has eggs on her head, the episode after Rainbow Dash called Twilight an egghead. I don't know, it's just a really funny observation I made. And the other thing is that this episode does a surprisingly good job at being subtle about how hard Rarity's been working on these dresses. After the first fade out to commercial, you actually see Rarity working on sewing someone's dress, and you can see her hair is all scrunched up, implying she's been hard at work for an extended period of time, and probably hasn't gotten much if any sleep at all. I appreciate small stuff like that. This all being said, I wouldn't quite say this episode is perfect. Moreover, I do not like it. I love it! But seriously, outside of maybe just one little nitpick, I have like no problems with the story at all. Maybe two. The first is that given what we know about Fluttershy, it feels like she's just a little too willing to go along with this little dress showcase. It's just hard to imagine that she wouldn't have stage fright. Maybe she's okay with it because it doesn't feel too personal? Or it could just be because it's a one-time thing she's doing solely for Rarity. Either way, it's not really a flaw. The second nitpick is that it does feel like Rarity's friends are aware that Rarity worked hard on her dresses, and it feels like they're not trying to look a gift horse in the mouth. That is until Rarity literally insists that they tell her what they really think of her work. But this is only a nitpick because the moral is also about how trying to please everyone means that you'll often please absolutely no one, including yourself. And that's an excellent moral that Rarity does need to take to heart, because it's not healthy to base your own self-worth or how others see you solely on your craft. Thinking about it, I don't really have anything negative to say about this episode. Oh, and here's a bonus fun fact. I like this episode so much, I use frames from it for thumbnails for my My Little Pony Reviewed series. It really is just a gift that keeps on giving. Episode 15, Feeling Pinkie Keen. Twilight tries to understand Pinkie Pie's Pinkie sense. Revisiting Season 1, I was dreading having to rewatch this episode. For those of you who don't know, I am a man of faith. In fact, I am a Christian. And to you all that might be sounding really strange, because after all, this episode's moral would actually be in defense of what my beliefs would be. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want to start off by saying some good things about this episode first. Namely the comedy. This episode is very funny. There are a lot of good jokes, from Twilight getting on a literal soapbox to start preaching about how magic is real but Pinkie Sense isn't, to the visual gags involving Pinkie Pie's combos, like the ear flop, knee twitch, eye flutter meaning a rainbow, and in the episode we see an ear flop, eye flutter, and knee twitch, which means look out for opening doors. And there's some very good timing to these jokes as well. Like, I actually had a really big laugh when Twilight got hit by the door the first time. Almost as big as in Dragonshy, when Pinkie Pie tried her part to try getting the dragon to leave. Pinkie Pie's characterization in this episode also I think is actually pretty good. She makes an interesting point about how unicorns have their own magic, so why can't Pinkie Sense be something magic related either? When you really think about it, unicorns already have ethereal magic to them. Pegasi can fly, that must take magic in and of itself as well. But then you get earth ponies, which initially don't seem to have any magical properties at all. Pinkie Sense, however, seems to be related to rheumatism, where the bones in your body would act up in response to certain situations. Which as a concept really isn't too out there, especially for this show. Unfortunately, that's not the explanation they actually go for. As a matter of fact, this episode doesn't offer an explanation at all for Pinkie Sense. Really, it just asks you to accept that Pinkie Sense is a real thing, and that's really as far as it's going to go. Which on its own isn't really a bad message. Remember, Friendship is Magic is only a cartoon. It doesn't have to explain every little intricate detail. And if it stayed on that scale, I'd honestly just have no problems with it. At least, no major problems, but we'll get to that soon enough. And trust me, I've got a lot to say about my major problems with this story. On the note of characterization, I do like Pinkie Pie, but she's only about, half of this episode? The other half largely focuses on Twilight, who is... my god, wow. Let me just throw my cards on the table. I hate Twilight in this episode. I think I understand what the writer was going for, trying to have Twilight be skeptical of Pinkie Sense because it's not something that she immediately can understand. But past the first third of the episode, her skepticism was not enjoyable at all. As far as being a scientist is concerned, she does a very bad job at that in this episode. She first tries to use his Richter scale to try and measure whether or not Pinkie Pie's twitches would actually mean anything. Which, to be frank, I have no idea how that would help you get any useful information at all, even if she did end up twitching. And then later in the episode, she's just trying to spy on Pinkie Pie under the pretense of her not knowing what's actually going on. This is not how science works. What you need to do is put Pinkie Pie in a controlled environment, and perform tests related to what Pinkie Sense can predict to see if it would actually do anything. Like dropping a pot somewhere nearby and seeing if Pinkie Pie's tail twitches from that. On that note, it's also around here this episode stopped feeling funny, and it just started to feel really cruel. Maybe you could argue it really isn't Twilight's place to question Pinkie Sense, but I find it to be a really big jerk move to try and attack her for just trying to understand something she doesn't understand. Like the bees diving towards her for no good reason was not funny. It felt more contrived and uncomfortable than actually hilarious. Like the world is just out to get her for trying to understand more about it. The part where Twilight falls down Applejack's apple cellar, which opens up for no good reason with no pony trying to come out of it, it's also just really stupid. How does the door open upwards with no one being behind the door to try and come out of it? You can't really call it cartoon logic when there's no logic in the cartoon that would actually make that make any sense. If the door couldn't support Twilight's weight as she was walking over it and it collapsed from underneath her, it would make a lot more sense as Applejack is just now building this cellar. You could argue then that maybe the hinges weren't on all the way. Back to Twilight's characterization though. She's not only a bad scientist in this episode, but she's also arguably a really bad friend. Up to the point in the episode where Pinkie Pie senses a doozy happening, she has been right the entire time. This prediction is also happening somewhere where Fluttershy is currently preoccupied with her frogs. And yet, she's more focused on trying to prove Pinkie Pie wrong than making sure one of her best friends is actually okay. This is bad. It paints her as being entirely heartless, which could also send a really bad message considering who she's supposed to be a stand-in for. Why can't she just drop her pride for one measly minute and just think, okay, I don't understand Pinkie Sense, but to be fair, it hasn't been wrong yet. It's better safe than sorry when one of my best friends could possibly be in danger. It feels like this episode is going too far and making Twilight out to be the bad guy. I get that Twilight just recently survived something that could have very well killed her with a freaking piano, but come on! Then there's the actual climax where there's a Hydra and the main four that we have here are trying to escape it. And it's here I have to say Twilight feels considerably dumber than she normally is in the show. Once they're a safe distance away from the Hydra that got caught in the bog, they start jumping over this chasm to escape from it, and Twilight decides to charge towards the Hydra, even though she can very easily jump the gap if not teleport across like she's done in several episodes up to now. Because it's actually presumed in the story that the Hydra would not be able to follow them across the chasm even if the rocks were still up for it to walk across. All going back really did was just put Twilight in needless danger for no good reason. And then when the pressure is on, I can imagine that maybe Twilight wasn't able to think straight because she's terrified. But like, she was terrified in the Ticketmaster too and was able to teleport there just fine. I'm not saying she has to think perfectly, but I'd appreciate if she at least considered teleporting. This really only exists for Twilight to take a leap of faith, as Pinkie Pie would put it, which, yeah. That takes us into the controversy of this episode, which is largely seen as a debate between science and religion. And it's pretty difficult to miss with how often this episode spouts lines like, "I cannot believe in anything that I cannot see," or "I refuse to believe in anything that I cannot explain." Okay, so what about Bridle Gossip then? Not too long ago, you learned a lesson that's about how you should not be judging a book by its cover. And I'll admit, to someone who has absolutely no exposure to earth pony magic before now, the idea of Pinkie sense does sound ridiculous. But considering how recently it was that you learned this lesson about not being judgmental, don't you think your time would be more valuably spent if you were to spend time asking questions and trying to understand something you don't, instead of immediately trying to brush something off as fake because you don't understand it yourself? There's a term for this mindset. It's called confirmation bias. It's a tendency that leads people to seek out and prefer information that supports what you already believe in. And I can see that this story is trying to get Twilight to let go of that. You see, the reality of the situation is that a lot of people who support science and think that science and religion do not mix, it's because people hear all these stories about miracles and supernatural things happening in the Bible, and they believe it's all a work of fiction. When in reality, the Bible also mentions scientifically accurate information regarding things like the water cycle, or the fact that the Earth just floats in space. When many philosophers after this fact was already made known in the Bible thought that the Earth was perched on some animals. When our understanding of the world was able to catch up to what the Bible teaches, we started to accept stuff that was at first proposed to be ridiculous as being incontrovertible facts. And this is the big takeaway. It's important to accept that you don't know everything. But accepting something that you don't understand behind the pretense of just needing to choose to believe in something acts like science and, again, religion act like they're diametrically opposed. And that's not a moral you want to teach kids. That's a terrible lesson. And the fact that that's what Twilight takes away from this all, it really burns me up inside. This moral should have been about Twilight learning to accept that she doesn't understand Pinkie sense, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. And that's okay. Some people get it and some don't. And it's okay to live with that. Life is all about exploring the greater world around you and learning more about the world you live in. And you can't learn anything if you're already dead set on believing you already know everything. Science is something that's always evolving and always being developed as we come to understand more of the world surrounding us. Be humble and be willing to learn. Otherwise, you may end up closing yourself off from a truth just because you think it isn't. That all being said, I do still believe that this episode deserves to be called a nightmare. It may not be as bad as I thought it was in my head after not seeing it in so long, nor do I even really feel uncomfortable looking at this episode nowadays either. But even in spite of this episode's top tier comedy, I don't like it. Because even though this episode is trying to speak in favor of what I believe in, I think it does a disservice to what I believe in because of how badly it actively misrepresents the issue. If you're still watching this video after what I've already been talking about, think for yourself. Be willing to challenge what you think you know and accept that you don't know everything. That's how brilliant minds are made. Episode 16, Sonic Rainboom. An anxious Rainbow Dash wants to perform her signature Sonic Rainboom for a competition. I find this episode to be very sweet, and probably not for the reasons that you'd expect, but what I really like about this episode is just how well it shows off the chemistry of the main six. Not to mention just how relatable the conflict itself actually is for Rainbow Dash. This really feels like one of the few times where she feels like an actual character and not just a braggart with very little beyond that. And it's just really good getting to see this anxious side of Rainbow Dash. I think it's safe to say that we've all been there before, where we may be known for having skills in a specific area, but being able to immediately feel the pressure between doing something for a few people and doing something in front of an entire crowd of hundreds or even thousands of others. And just knowing the pressure that Rainbow Dash is under, it makes it really easy to want to cheer for her too. It also makes it so that her friends who can't fly, being able to support her just feels all the more sweet. I like that Rarity is the one to pick up on her stage fright as well. And it makes a lot of sense coming from her, because of the main six, she is by far the most socially conscious. It all just puts a really warm fuzzy in your heart, and it really speaks to how well these six really get along with each other. No, I don't mean to take any shots here of future episodes, but compare this to All Bottled Up in Season 7. In that episode, the main six go on a getaway to Manhattan Escapes to basically partake in an escape room. From what I heard, this is supposed to juxtapose between what's a healthy friendship and an unhealthy friendship. Considering that as this was going on, Starlight and Trixie had to take care of their own predicament back in Ponyville. And honestly, I'm not sure if this is the best way to put it, but the main six's friendship in that episode just feels phoned in. Like, it's just really unnatural, and I'd honestly prefer if the episode was only about Starlight and Trixie. Because we, the audience, already know that the main six have a healthy friendship amongst each other. But unlike Sonic Rainboom, not much is really done with it beyond just stating the obvious. I wouldn't say it's quite as good as Dragonshy, but I do appreciate at least that most of the main six do get a chance to shine in this episode. The only real outlier is probably Applejack. But that's fine, the fact that she's here at all honestly is enough. Fluttershy's roaring cheering when the Rainboom is finally pulled off was also a pretty big highlight too. Fun fact, both Pinkie Pie and Fluttershy are voiced by the same voice actress, Andrea Libman. So if ever you were wondering why Fluttershy sounded like Pinkie Pie, that's likely the reason. She broke out into the other pony. And otherwise, I thought she was a pretty decent character in this episode. A lot of her behavior just felt par for the course, like spurring on Rainbow Dash's anxiety with her own anxieties about being in front of a crowd. But beyond that, she is good support all the same. The way Rarity is characterized though is very interesting beyond what I've already said. I find it funny how she completely lost the plot and how she went to Cloud Zero to support Rainbow Dash, and then ended up competing alongside her. It inadvertently made her nerves even worse. And then because she just forgets the warning that Twilight gave her because of her wings being so delicate, she nearly falls to her death and becomes a pony crepe. It actually makes for a pretty big climax, considering that, again, a member of the main six nearly died in an episode. Just unlike last time, it was Applejack to save Twilight, this time it's Rarity being rescued by Rainbow Dash. Funny how that works out. The two most competitive ponies are also the only members of the main six to have actively saved lives. You're probably already aware of this as well, but this plot point has a lot of similarities to the story of Icarus. Just where his wings were made of feathers glued with wax, Rarity's wings were made with gossamer and morning dew. And another big difference, Icarus actually died at the end of the story revolving around him, compared to Rarity, who merely just had a near-death experience and not an actual death. I remember hearing this complaint of how people complained about Princess Celestia not doing anything when Rarity was falling to her death, but like, does it really matter? Like, that's what the Wonderbolts were for, and Rarity still survived thanks to Rainbow Dash. That's all that's really important. I don't think I really have anything else to say about Sonic Rainboom though, but I do like it, and with certainty I would call it a good episode. It feels like every time I watch Sonic Rainboom, I like it just a little bit more than last time. Episode 17, Stairmaster. Fluttershy babysits the Cutie Mark Crusaders. This is one story I feel really hit or miss over. I do think at worst, the pairing of the CMC and Fluttershy can be very unique, but I also just can't help but feel like not very much was actually done with that pairing. What I'm trying to say is that the Cutie Mark Crusaders in this episode don't really stand out very well individually. Throughout most of the episode, they act basically interchangeably, which I think is actually a pretty big misstep. There are moments where their individual personalities do shine through, but the only one that really comes to mind is Sweetie Belle singing the lullaby. And I get it, not only are they just kids, but this is the first episode since Call of the Cutie they've all been together. Moreover, that was the first episode where they all had a speaking role, so they all could really only be developed further from here. And admittedly, it is pretty hard to critique their characterization, considering I've seen this show up to season 7, so in my mind, they're more developed now than they were back then. That being said, there are little bits and pieces of their dialogue where I have to wonder, couldn't a different member have said that and it would make more sense? For example, it was Scootaloo that had the idea of going to the Everfree Forest where Applebloom and Sweetie Belle agreed with her. Why could that not have been Applebloom that had the idea? She's actually been in there before. And assuming both Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo have parents of their own, they would probably have told them about the dangers of being in the Everfree Forest. It just feels like better care could have been taken to make the dialogue match who'd actually have to be saying it. Also, this is probably more of a pet peeve of mine than anyone else, but I really do wish this episode gave the CMC more credit as actually being characters. You know, give them actual personalities beyond being loud and annoying. Because speaking personally, I really don't care for the shout, and especially not the screaming they do near the end of the episode when the cockatrice is on their tail. Maybe if just one of them were screaming it'd be okay, but not all three. It felt actively grating to hear. I think I'd actually prefer they were either sobbing or maybe just shouting for Fluttershy to help them. At the very least, you have 3 members of the CMC, they can all do something different. So yeah, there you have it. I don't like the CMC very much here. They're not horrible characters, it just feels like the way they were written here was pretty lazy. Though speaking of Fluttershy, she's likable enough. It's kinda interesting actually. We do see Twilight in this episode, but she appears very little throughout the entire thing. It's pretty similar to Call of the Cutie actually, where most of this episode is focused around Fluttershy and having to take care of the CMC for the night. But outside of using her stare for whatever she has to use it for, she doesn't really do very much in the episode. For the most part, what she tries to do is just keep the CMC from hurting themselves. Or failing that, trying to minimize the damage they do to her cottage. And it's interesting enough to see. We get some fun moments with the CMC and Fluttershy bouncing off of each other. We also get introduced to this ability that Fluttershy has where she can stare at animals and I guess they lose their free will? I don't really know how to describe it, but it looks really creepy whatever it is. Maybe you can call it a mother stare of disapproval. I mean, she's not a mom, but you get the idea. Seriously, what else would you call it? She stared at Cockatrice in the eyes as she was being turned into stone and got it to actually reverse the effects of its stare. Which, to its credit, was a really cool scene, considering the fact that she up and stared death in the face, basically, and lived to tell the tale. But it all boils down to just staring intensely at someone or something, and I guess scolding for being a bad boy or girl. Though again, while I would say Fluttershy is likable enough in this episode, I still wouldn't say she was at her A game here either. Riddle me this. You're aware of this creature that can turn people into stone, and you're gonna warn these dumb kids who wandered into the Everfree Forest that there's a creature that can actually do that. Why is the first thing you mention the fact that it looks like a chicken head perked on top of a snake? I mean, I could excuse the fact that maybe she wanted to say it in a different order if she was going to mention immediately after what it could actually do. But no, as soon as she describes what the creature looks like, she is trying to urge the CMC again to get out of the forest with her. Listen, it's generally wise to start with what the creature itself can actually do, rather than trying to explain what it looks like first. Especially when what it looks like is the only thing you actually tell them. And the sad thing is that this is actually a recurring problem with how Fluttershy relays information, considering this is something she does again in a future episode, A Health of Information, where I guess it's more worthwhile to mention the fact that Zecora's coughing up bubbles than the fact that she turned into a tree if you don't get her cured. Like, what the heck, girl, I know you're smarter than that. I know the rule of this show don't tell, but we've already seen what it could do, and explaining the danger now makes a lot more sense considering the stakes anyway. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of this episode. Like, the story's fine, the moral is pretty good about biting off more than you can chew being a bad thing. It's just that the characterization needs some serious work, and the dialogue itself is just confusing sometimes. To be honest, this is an episode I wanted to call a nightmare when I first reviewed Season 1, but I shied away from it because a lot of people tried to tell me that this episode was really good. And you know what? I can't disagree more with that. I don't want to think this episode is bad, but I don't like it. Still, I can't see this episode being much worse than it actually is now. I mean, the CMC still have their charming moments throughout the story. I still found Opal to be really funny in this episode as well. And for what it's worth, Fluttershy was really cool here too. But I can't do it. Not just because I think this episode really doesn't deserve being called okay, but the night I recorded my commentary after this episode was already watched, I had a nightmare. And believe it or not, it involved this episode. What happened in it was that Fluttershy was fully turned to stone by the cockatrice by trying to stare it down. It had this smug expression, and after only a few seconds it managed to win out. And as soon as it happened, I managed to wake up with the face of the CMC being unknown. I'm not kidding, it actually happened. And you know what? Congratulations, Stairmaster. You're the first episode in my recollection to actually give me a nightmare after watching you. And that right there I think deserves being called a nightmare episode. Yeah, I'll be the one to admit, I think this episode is massively overrated. I'd even go as far as to say I think this episode's worse than other episodes I call nightmares in future seasons, like Mystery Under Friendship Expressed and Baby Cakes. Plain and simple though, I think this episode is just bad. Episode 18, The Showstoppers. The Cutie Mark Crusaders enter a talent show to discover their special talents. Oh god. I'll be frank, I think now, maybe I was giving the CMC too much credit in Stairmaster. Because the Showstoppers makes the CMC out to be entirely brain dead. Let's just get right to the point. We get to see what the CMC are best at in this episode. We are shown that Scootaloo can shred it on a scooter, that Applebloom is absolutely masterful of carpentry, considering she managed to reconstruct that treehouse that Applejack had all by herself, and we get to hear Sweetie Belle's angelic singing. This in and of itself isn't the problem though, because after all, if the CMC had come to the same conclusion that we the audience did, then fine, at least by the end of the episode they came out better for it. But no. They never did learn by the end of the episode where they're actually at their best. Even though they themselves can see their special talents in their own friends, they are none the wiser to their own abilities, and it makes them look beyond stupid. Not helped, by the way, that it's basically impossible to miss what they're really at their best with. They really drill into your head just where their special talents really lie. Worse yet, when the talent show actually comes along, they all opt for the worst possible roles they could have actually gotten. Applebloom can't dance, Scootaloo can't sing, and Sweetie Belle can't design. And by the end of it all, they're all farther away from their goal than when they actually started. It would be one thing if the CMC were just happy to do something together, and maybe they started taking to heart that they should try to just have more fun doing stuff together instead of only ever stressing about their cutie marks. But no, they start by thinking only about their cutie marks, and they end the episode only ever thinking about how they're gonna get their cutie marks. It's an all-around awful start for their arc in this show. Beyond that, this episode is just so boring. When you get past just how hard they hammer it in what they're best at, a lot of this episode then just rehashes Call of the Cutie and Stairmaster. Except those episodes were a lot more modest about what the CMC would be best at. Especially Stairmaster, where we hear Sweetie Belle singing up a tune. You could infer that her special talent would involve singing, and yes, it would make perfect sense in hindsight. But there's nothing to infer in the Showstoppers, it's already confirmed. And in Call of the Cutie, what Applebloom does try to get a cutie mark is so ridiculous that it actually ends up being funny. Nothing about the Showstoppers, meanwhile, is funny. It's just slow and boring. Worse yet, the gift of hindsight being in Season 7 now wouldn't save this episode either. Plenty of reviewers at this point in the show were able to see that this is what the CMC would be best at. The way that this episode is written, the fact that the CMC don't get their cutie marks at the end, in and of itself, is a plot hole. You can't dedicate so much time to establishing what the CMC will be best at, and then end the episode saying that they have no idea what they're best at. It's illogical, it makes the story feel incomplete, and it's just frustrating to watch. Especially since Twilight gives them the advice to try things they already like to do and are already good at. I mean, no normal person goes to a talent show to find out what they're good at. You go to a talent show to showcase what you're good at. Otherwise, it'd be like if in Sonic Rainboom, Rainbow Dash is going to perform a trick that she literally never tried before, and as a result had no experience actually doing it. Even the parts I'm convinced I'm supposed to find charming and cute, like the CMC gearing up for the talent show and helping each other out, I'm just getting a headache. I'm just thinking, how do you not recognize what you're best at here? And that's saying something, because this caused me actual pain to think about, but not the singing that's purposefully off-key at the end of the episode. And not only does this part suck, because even though the music itself is actually decent, the singing sucks. But I really don't know what I'm supposed to be getting from this. Am I supposed to find this funny? Because it's not funny just seeing the audience stare blankly at the CMC doing their thing. It was kinda funny when Applejack was grimacing at this, but she's really the only member of the audience actually having any kind of reaction until the end. And the reaction that the show actually gets is laughter. I don't get it. What was supposed to be so funny about seeing these three fillies badly perform an earnest ballad? If you succeed at singing badly, and you do that on purpose, you still get bad singing at the end of it all. Maybe I'd find it funnier if the show itself was cringing at what was actually happening and it wasn't just Applejack. You know, like what Season 4's Equestria Games did. But that's not what happens. Also, I can't help but think that being laughed off the stage over something you wanted to present as being taken seriously will be really freaking traumatic, which makes the ending where the CMC are actively happy over getting the Best Comedy Act prize really off-putting. It all just feels extremely tone-deaf. And it feels like the episode itself is saying that if you are completely oblivious to the obvious and you do things you're not good at, you're an idiot for doing it, even if it's something that you actually enjoy. And it's safe to say that's not a good lesson. To be fair, it's more of an implication rather than an actual lesson, but that is what I'm getting out of this episode. And I think you can see why. Needless to say, it's a nightmare episode. On all sides. The story was awful, the characterization was absolutely hot garbage, it's ungodly boring, and overall, it just felt like a massive waste of time. Am I the only one who thinks this episode was originally 11 minutes long? Because of all the padding in the story, I could definitely believe that. Episode 19, A Dog and Pony Show. While collecting gems for an order, Rarity gets abducted by diamond dogs. Back when I saw this episode trying to review the entire first season for the first time, I'll admit I wasn't really feeling it too much. I still thought it was good, but I just didn't get the same reaction as I guess other people got out of this episode. A few things did bug me, like the fact that Spike had the gemstones still that Rarity gave him, even though just earlier he was salivating at the thought of just digging them up, and I thought he'd have eaten the one he already had by then. Now though, I'm not really sure how much that actually matters. But did I remember that Twilight actually learned Rarity's gem fighting spell? And with that, this becomes a plot hole. Because there was no shortage of gems to find in the Badlands, or the woods as Spike would call it. So honestly, I think I would have preferred if Spike had already eaten the gem and instead reminded Twilight of the gem finding spell that she apparently already knew. Either that, or for the purpose of the story, abandon having Twilight use the gem finding spell entirely and have Spike sniff the gems out. I don't think that'd be a stretch considering Spike up and eats them. I mean, maybe you could argue that gemstones don't have an odor in the real world, but it's a cartoon. They could have different rules for reality in the show. All I'm saying is, in Equestria Girls, Spike was a dog. I know this episode came up before that was ever conceived, but I could totally see that making sense for Spike. Maybe the odor is on a wavelength that only Spike could smell, I don't freaking know, but Twilight just knowing this spell comes off as convenient and nothing else. Besides that pain point, I think this episode's just really good. The story here I find to actually be a lot of fun, seeing Rarity get abducted and basically have to use her own wits to survive. And not only is it fun to basically see her bully the Diamond Dogs just by being herself, except amped up to the nth degree, but it puts on full display just how good of a character Rarity really is, being able to stand on her own like this. And it does a lot to make her look good after having to be rescued in Sonic Rainboom as well. The way her friends also envision the danger that she's actually in is also really funny to see, especially when Spike is actively seeing himself as a Chad, fighting the Diamond Dogs off and rushing in to rescue her. My favorite pony in this episode though, discounting Rarity, is probably Applejack. She's given a lot of really good dialogue in this episode, some of which is just so perfect for the situation I had to make a quote out of it. I don't really have much else to say regarding the characters though. Beyond who I already mentioned, Fluttershy does envision what Rarity must be going through down on the ground, but beyond that, she doesn't have much impact on the plot. And then both Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash were basically just along for the ride in this episode. I do like how much credit is given to Spike as a character, both in his ability to solve problems and his willingness to fight when Rarity's in actual danger. But beyond that, yeah, I just don't really have much else to say about this episode. It's good, just not something I'm really crazy about. Episode 20. Green isn't your color. Rarity is jealous of Fluttershy's unwanted newfound fame. I feel like if I had anything positive to say about this episode, it's the comedy. It didn't make me laugh as hard as an episode like, say, Dragonshy or even Feeling Pinkie Keen, but a lot of the jokes in this episode do work really well. And honestly, it's hard to pick out a favorite. My favorite joke still involves Spike. It's kinda adorable, honestly, just how obsessed he is over Rarity in this episode, and there's a lot of funny moments between the two, like when Rarity's jumping for joy on Spike's tail and he doesn't seem to really mind. The comedic timing with photo finishes scenes are also really good in this episode. Like after the very first photo shoot with Fluttershy, where she just packs everything up and just leaves out of the boutique. The strongest element of this episode, though, is probably the characterization. I feel like that's the strongest draw that Megan McCarthy has for the episodes that she writes for the show. It just feels like the way that she envisions the characters would perfectly mirror what I think the characters would act like. To the point where retroactively, it feels weird seeing Fluttershy have absolutely no reservations modeling for Rarity and Suited for Success, when she makes it abundantly clear that she hates being a model and green isn't your color. I am not gonna act like other writers have an incorrect perception of the characterization, I just really prefer how Megan handles the characters when she writes episodes. As for the story itself, honestly I think it's pretty interesting. It gives us a glimpse of the personalities between both Rarity and Fluttershy. Rarity, who sees one of her best friends basically living her dream and becoming increasingly jealous of her, and Fluttershy living basically her worst possible nightmare, and not being able to quit out of fear of betraying her friend's wishes. And this case of miscommunication also leads to its own humor as well. Like Rarity envying Fluttershy being literally stalked by fans, and seeing Fluttershy's annoyance with having to have makeup be put on her and then taken right back off. Also, great social commentary showing that you can make anything look good if you have the right person praising it. I love the scene where Twilight makes a fool of Fluttershy, and Fluttershy still gets clapped by the audience because Rarity said so while she was dressed up. It really speaks to just how big of sheep people tend to be. Another point I want to mention as well is just how good the ending itself actually is. I like the fact that both Fluttershy and Rarity were able to resolve this conflict all on their own, and it shares a good message about how you should not be afraid to share your true feelings with your friends. Though to be honest, I'm a little iffy about the part of the moral which talks about keeping secrets. As a matter of fact, I had to vent for a little bit, but let me just make a correction from my very first time reviewing Season 1. Green Isn't Your Color is not an okay episode. It's a good one. But I'd have to say it's only a good episode in spite of being in Season 1, considering how some of the mandates of Season 1 actually kind of hindered the story here. And that brings me to my biggest problem with Green Isn't Your Color, and it's Pinkie Pie. Well, that's not entirely true. It's a combination of both Pinkie Pie and Twilight Sparkle. I feel like this episode would have been better if it focused solely on Fluttershy and Rarity's drama, and kept Pinkie Pie and Twilight out entirely. Because the most that they do add is make an easy out to solve the conflict that's never actually taken or even considered. Failing that, both Fluttershy and Rarity told Twilight just to not tell the other pony their secret. A secret that Pinkie Pie is aware of considering how she's been snooping the entire time, but hasn't sworn off of squealing on. Now I'm not gonna just say Pinkie Pie should have just told everyone the truth, because by her own admission, then neither Fluttershy or Rarity would trust her anymore either. But there are other ponies that could be telling the truth too. After all, Rarity and Fluttershy only made Twilight promise to not tell each other. Given that line of logic, wouldn't you be able to tell another friend like Applejack or Rainbow Dash? I mean, I doubt they'd squeal either considering the fact that it's clearly a secret that has to be kept from the ponies that have to hear it. But like, the option is open, you could have very well taken that if you wanted. And failing that, just have Rarity and Fluttershy tell Twilight not to tell any pony, especially not the other pony that actually has to hear it. I think this episode is fine without having all of its bases be entirely covered, but I would have appreciated just that extra bit of attention to detail. I mean, after all, when Twilight squealed about Spike having a crush on Rarity, the only pony that heard that was Photo Finish, and I highly doubt that she really cared what Spike thinks about another pony. Unless, of course, Pinkie Pie told Spike, and that would really squeak me out if that was the case. Because if that possibility was available throughout the entire freaking episode, then the story would be entirely pointless. And then there's other situations, like you're promising to keep a secret for someone, but what if the secret itself is actually bad? Like, for example, someone got a new hat, and you wanted to say to them that they look better without the hat on. My point is, I feel like true friends won't sugarcoat how they feel to try and spare your feelings. But in all fairness, this is very well why the second half of the moral is so important to this episode. It feels like it completes the moral rather than making it feel kind of off. And I just realized that my rant got me to respect this episode just a little bit more. That's impressive, but not necessarily surprising. Megan McCarthy's a writer without rival. Episode 21, Over a Barrel. The Appaloosa settlers and native buffalo quarrel over the land. I find this episode to be extremely funny for a variety of reasons. There's lots of strange details I can pick apart, like the train ride to Appaloosa has the train be pulled by ponies. And I have to ask why, if it's also shown to be steam-powered. It's an example of some extremely confusing world building. But let's be frank, there's a much more pressing issue with this episode that I know y'all are dying to hear me talk about, so let's begin. First off, this is one of the most controversial episodes of Season 1, largely because of the moral and the context it was delivered in, where the settler ponies who built Appaloosa have planted an orchard of apple trees on the buffalo's sacred land, and the buffalo themselves want their land back. Right off the bat, the problem with the moral is as clear as day. This episode tries to put the buffalo and the ponies on equal footing, when the reality is very, very different than what this episode wants to believe. No, what's happening in reality is that the ponies that are suddenly in Appaloosa are imposing on the buffalo, taking advantage of land that was never theirs to actually use. There really is no disputing this. The ponies are in the wrong. Especially when this episode has dialogue that would imply that the buffalo did try to reason with the ponies and they did not want to listen. Little Miss Strongheart says that the ponies refused to move their trees. That would imply that the buffalo did try to talk with the ponies before and they didn't get anywhere. Without that bit of dialogue, this episode may have actually had a point, because then the ponies should at least claim ignorance. But because this episode says that the ponies themselves refuse to move their trees, I have no choice but to believe that the buffalo's actions are justifiable. This isn't like with Griffon The Brush Off, where we get to see that Gilda does a bad job communicating. At least from my perspective, the buffalo are the victims. And for that matter, Applejack really needs to shut up in this episode. I get that it's her family she's trying to defend, but A, this really isn't your fight to fight, and B, let's just throw this out there. Applejack, the element of honesty, is actively defending her family stealing from the buffalo. Maybe she's just being brutally honest, but no. There is a difference between being brutally honest and just thinking entirely selfishly. What Applejack is proposing is like if you were taking someone else's backyard for yourself to do whatever you wanted with it. That's not how property works. It's not up to the Appaloosans. If the buffalo want the trees off of their land, you are obligated to listen to them. This really is not a good story to try teaching a moral about compromise and sharing. And that absolutely is a massive problem with the story. It's tone deaf and completely misunderstands the issue that's actually happening. It doesn't help either that this episode is really on the nose about the allegory that it's going for. Not only do the buffalo call the ponies the settler ponies, which is to contrast the fact that the buffalo themselves are native to this area, but the buffalo themselves have all this native headgear and they live in teepees. As if being an entirely different species would not be enough to distinguish the two from each other. There is an alarming lack of subtlety in the storytelling in this episode, and I can definitely see why it would make some people feel uncomfortable watching it. Honestly, it's a shame, because beyond that issue with the story, I actually really like this episode. Season 1 is home to a lot of funny episodes, but this just might take the cake. I think just about every joke in this episode managed to land for me, and even the ones that didn't I thought were at least mildly amusing. Like Applejack Baby in Bloomberg, where Rarity's reaction to her friends just talking throughout the night. Or the reaction that Chief Thunderhooves and Sheriff Silverstar had to Pinkie Pie's song about sharing and caring. Yeah, I'll admit, Pinkie Pie in this episode was not good. She really adds to the tone-deaf conflict and really comes off more as preaching than anything else. But the way the characters react to Pinkie Pie in this episode is well worth it. And I also think it give props to the fact that her singing doesn't resolve the conflict. Well, at least not directly. Maybe because since seeing this episode I've seen the times they were changeling, but I really hate seeing conflicts being wrapped up because ponies sing a song in the episode that's supposed to solve everything. Another thing I appreciate is the fact that the buffalo themselves set the terms for keeping the orchard that the Appaloosans had on their land, as a way of symbolizing that they do in fact have the power to decide what actually happens to the trees there. I just wish though that this episode didn't call it sharing and caring, and instead just called it what it actually is. In 2 words, it's paying rent. The actual war itself also had a lot of really funny moments, like seeing some mares and some buffalo look like they're ready to box with each other, or just all the slapstick that happens in the fighting itself. And all because Pinkie Pie instigated a war and actually got caught in the middle of it. It's super cartoony and I just love seeing it. Don't get me wrong, I know this episode is extremely flawed and has lots of issues with it, and I definitely can get behind calling this episode bad, but gosh darn it, I had fun. So you know what? I'm calling this a dream episode. Basically call this a guilty pleasure. I know where this episode goes wrong, and I can respect if you don't like it, but I just do. It's also funny to think that I think this is the only episode where the buffalo actually appear in, and given the controversy this episode sparked, that's probably for the best. Episode 22, A Bird in the Hoof. Fluttershy takes it upon herself to restore Princess Celestia's pet to good health. Every so often I find an episode of a cartoon show and I just have to ask myself, what the heck did I just watch? The actual story regarding Fluttershy and Philomena I guess was okay enough regarding actual structure to the story, but everything surrounding it is just bizarre. Now I think all the main six are guilty of this at least in some way, shape, or form. Like for starters, Pinkie Pie seems more hyper than usual. I'll give her credit, she does an amazing roundhouse as she leaves Sugar Cube Corner, but there's really no rhyme or reason to how Pinkie Pie acts in this episode beyond, I guess she's very hyperactive. And that goes for Rainbow-2, who just seems to want to get the guards to laugh and there really is nothing else beyond that. These aren't necessarily flaws with the episode, but they feel like actions that were just taken because the writer probably thought it'd be funny to see. It doesn't feel like either pony has any motivation for how they're acting in this episode. Then there's Rarity, who just seems uncharacteristically bitter throughout the entire episode. I get not wanting to get dirty, that's entirely in character for her, but even beyond that, her character feels entirely one note. And then there's Applejack, who in one episode has absolutely no problem eating s'mores with her mouth full, but suffers from choice paralysis with eating her own Celestia, as if she doesn't know that she's just supposed to enjoy herself and eat whatever's on the table. She doesn't really read like Applejack, she reads more like Fluttershy if anything. To that, it feels like she's just out of character in this episode. I get that there very well may be a motivation behind that, considering that Twilight's putting a lot of emphasis on her friends making a good first impression with Celestia, but I personally don't believe that's the case for two reasons. One, like Fluttershy says, Celestia already likes Twilight's friends. If she didn't, she would not have made arrangements for you to stay in Ponyville so you wouldn't have to leave them behind. And two, it would create a plot hole, because then Pinkie Pie would definitely be guilty of not following that up. And speaking of Twilight, I know she's neurotic, but she's neurotic to an extreme extent in this episode, and it actually feels unnatural for her. Shortly after brunch of Celestia, when she gets called away for the mayor, she just shows up to Fluttershy's cottage unannounced, and her motivation behind that is to thank Fluttershy for being a good behavior around Celestia. What? I'm sorry, that's bogus. That's not a good enough reason to justify Twilight being involved in the conflict now. The problem is that this action feels unnatural for anybody to do, not just Twilight. Why not something like, say, news of Philomena missing happened to spread, and now Twilight's looking for Fluttershy's help to locate her? It would make a lot more sense considering the fact that this episode goes to great lengths establishing the fact that Fluttershy is really good with animals. As is, Twilight's involvement comes out of nowhere and feels contrived at best. And the most she really contributes to the episode is fear-mongering for Fluttershy, which isn't really helped when we see Celestia earlier in this episode, and she looks really chill. To be fair, that's probably the point, because Fluttershy does try to correct her thinking. And on that note, it's not the worst case of this I've ever seen either, especially compared to Triple Threat in Season 7. But considering the fact that Fluttershy did actually steal Philomena from Celestia, at least the argument can be made. I still feel this scene doesn't work though, because really, what other options do you have? If you don't return Philomena, you'd be pet napping. So the way this episode goes, you're basically damned if you do and damned if you don't. As far as Twilight's characterization is concerned otherwise though, she feels like an exaggerated starlight glimmer. I rest my case. Long story short, the characterization in this story was horrible. As far as the conflict revolving around only Fluttershy and Philomena though, I get the faintest feeling that this episode's trying to be gross, which if so is a hilarious fail on this show's part, because it's genuinely extremely difficult if not impossible to make things look truly gross given how clean the art style actually is. And that being said, there's borderline zero plot. The most of this is just Fluttershy trying things to get Philomena to feel better and none of it actually working. And nothing about it is particularly interesting or compelling or even funny. No, for the most part it just felt tepid and repetitive, which isn't really a good thing when this show is trying to entertain. There are moments I did laugh at, but they really only happened when this show got so stupid that I couldn't help but think, okay, that is ridiculous, I have to laugh at that. Particularly the moment when Pinkie Pie roundhouses a pony outside of Sugar Cube Corner, and where Philomena's disguise reading a newspaper as Fluttershy and Twilight go to interrogate her, and they don't recognize that's actually her. The end result wasn't very funny, but the fact that Philomena had this stupid fake mustache on, and all of her feathers were in the right place despite actively having feathers lost on her head and with tape on her head at that, Honestly, I think I laughed more at the fact that it was a continuity error than the actual joke attempted here. Because the actual joke itself sucks. Fluttershy and Twilight aren't stupid. And this show isn't really about the main six not being very bright either. Compare this to a show like, say, Tom and Jerry when they're working together for something. Even though they're both smart in their own right, the trouble they'd have in trying to keep up with their target when, like, say, it's a baby in a construction site, comes a lot more from the environment, not their own stupidity. Even looking only at the show itself, you can compare this to the Ticketmaster, which had a much better excuse for Twilight being harder to track down, and yet the Stampede of Ponies actually did a much better job keeping up with Twilight and Spike. And even then, that scene wasn't very good anyway. You can likely tell that this episode's all over the place, but you know what I've heard? A bird in the hoof is worth two in the bush. Well, let's not beat around it. It's a nightmare episode. Incoherent as the story itself actually was, I still don't think this episode was worse than Look Before You Sleep even. I do at least like the fact that we do get to see more Princess Celestia in this episode, and she's actually shown to have a pretty cute sense of humor being a little bit of a prankster herself. But otherwise, I just have a really hard time finding an Amy to care. You might be able to do worse than this, but you could definitely do better. Episode 23, The Cutie Mark Chronicles. The Cutie Mark Crusaders asked the main six how they got their cutie marks. This was such a cute episode. Essentially, this episode acts as an anthology, showing how all the main six got their cutie marks in the past, and the stories themselves range from being pretty funny to being largely endearing. Let's start off by saying that I think the CMC's characterization of this episode is at its best so far. It feels like now we get an actually good grasp of how they all act as people. We already had a few episodes focused on Applebloom, but regarding the other two, Scootaloo is a bit of a tomboy and she looks up the Rainbow Dash a lot. Meanwhile, Sweetie Belle has some actual reservations over doing stuff that's considered dangerous, which seems like a notable improvement after Stairmaster. Unrelated, by the way, I find it really funny how this episode confirms that Spike has actually ziplined before. I don't know why, I just thought that was really interesting. And both Sweetie Belle and Applebloom hold their sisters to very high regards, which is just adorable. I also find it really funny how they sooner would actually think Pinkie Pie when they think of a fearless pony before Rainbow Dash, and how having the choices be narrowed down to a Pegasus makes them think of Fluttershy, because remember back to Stairmaster, she saved their lives like with the cockatrice there. It may not make any sense when you first think about it, but give it a little time, you can rationalize a reason why they say that. And then we get into the stories themselves about the cutie marks, which have their own reasons for really being very enjoyable. Applejack's is a story of homesickness, where she didn't really realize what she had until it was gone. I think it is pretty funny how it's presented how she's so out of touch with Manhattan, and the Manhattanites don't even know what a rooster is. Strange, I didn't know being in the city and being high class meant not knowing what basic fauna was. Oh, this is a little note on the side. If Applejack doesn't have a cutie mark yet, it would likely mean that Applebloom wasn't born yet either, and Applejack's parents were still alive. Just thought you should know that. Fluttershy's story is just drop dead adorable meanwhile. Her slightly more lanky body implies that she's also older than her friends too. And the way she's portrayed when she's actually down to earth paints a picture of somebody who's startled easily, but can put her fears aside when she sees others that are more distressed than she is. I also really like how Fluttershy's story portrays Rainbow Dash. She comes off as someone that really does not like bullies and will stand up to them when she sees it happening. Kinda like my mom. The song itself, meanwhile, wasn't really too memorable. The way it starts, I think, fits Fluttershy's character pretty well, but then it gets all bouncy at a beat, and by then it sounds like something I'd expect from Pinkie Pie, if anything. Not bad, not by any stretch, but let's just say there's a reason I'm not necessarily too on board with using it for this video. We then see Rarity, and something I find interesting with her is that she's been sewing ever since she was a little filly. So this passion she's had for her craft, she's had for a long while. And the way she's dragged by her horn to find this rock with all these gemstones on it was also really funny. Though I do have a bit of a complaint here, though this is the only real complaint I have with this episode. I mean, I do have more, but they're not necessarily this episode's fault. But in these flashbacks, there are a few shots where we get to see the moon. And in both Rarity and Pinkie Pie, the moon itself was full, and yet there is not a single sign of the mare in the moon at all. Time to think of it, after the first episode, Princess Luna has just been entirely absent. She's never seen, mentioned, or even implied to have even existed after the pilot. And if there was an episode you'd think we'd be able to see her, it'd be in this one. That aside, I also really like Rarity's reaction to when she finally gets to the rock, and she just looks so fed up with the fact that that rock is literally all she found with her horn. It's a funny story. I think Twilight's my favorite though. Basically for how there's absolutely no setup to her story at all, the CMC is just trying to find Rainbow Dash again, and in the very next shot, it's just Twilight's turn. I love her frenzy-driven enthusiasm when she's recounting her story. It's really cute, and we even get to see how she and Spike first met. Essentially, the Rainboom happened, and then Twilight entered the Avatar state. It also shows how she began to become Celestia's protege. And it also does a much better job showing how Twilight's special talent involves magic in general, and not having it just be told us that in Boast Busters. If I had any complaints, however, it's this. And note that this is not this episode's fault. But in the future seasons, we hear that Twilight has an older brother, Shining Armor, and yet he's absolutely nowhere to be seen in this episode. This is especially jarring because we later on hear that Shining Armor is the captain of the Royal Guard. And this isn't even getting into the fact that she knew Princess Cadence before she got her Cutie mark, so she wouldn't really need Celestia for that either. But again, this is Season 1. I'm certain I'll find many more opportunities to talk about this problem in Season 2 where it'll actually be relevant, since the finale for that season is a cancel-out wedding. And as a result, I'm not going to hold that against this episode because that really would not be very fair at all. Pinkie Pie's, I'll admit, was just extremely goofy. She explains that she lived on a rock farm, and I guess what she does on that farm is move rocks from one part to another. I'll admit, I don't think I've heard something as ridiculous as that in a long time. But then she sees the Rainboom and it makes her smile for the first time in her life. And from then on, she wants to make others experience the very same joy that she felt in that one moment, which is actually really sweet. It also sets up the foundation for Pinkie Pie's character throughout the entire show, as she's a pony that puts a lot of stock in how others feel about what she does for them. There is one gripe I have, though it's not this episode's fault, again. But of Pinkie Pie's sisters, we see both Limestone and Marble, but no Maud. And that's weird because of Pinkie Pie's sisters, Maud is the first one we really get to see more of after Season 1. So like, why not just use one of the sisters that we already know Pinkie Pie to have? Why make him an entirely new character? Ultimately a nitpick, but I think that I should mention it. Finally, there's Rainbow Dash, and her story is ultimately pretty cool. It's basically her winning a race and confirming a myth about the Sonic Rainbow being a real thing. And also, I had to give this episode props for making it justifiable how the bullies did not see the Rainboom actually happen, because in trying to keep up, they managed to crash out of the race, and as a result, they missed the Rainboom when it actually happened. That's really good, I like that. In total, you have 6 cute, endearing, or otherwise just really funny short stories all wrapped up in one good episode. It just has this really special feel, like this is one of the most grand episodes we've had so far in the show. Maybe a little sappy, but given the occasion, and well, the characters, I think we can let it slide. Even now seeing this episode, I feel absolutely enchanted by it. Episode 24. Owl's Well That Ends Well. Spike gets one-upped by an owl Twilight adopts as a nocturnal assistant. I can with absolute confidence say that I am left entirely dumbfounded at what I just watched. Everything positive I have to say about this episode happens in the first 8 minutes. I thought the atmospheric moment with the main 6 and their sisters watching the meteor shower was really cool. I don't know why, I think I just really like seeing the main 6 just live their lives and enjoy the view. It's also nice that this episode is teaching new words to kids, like centennial meaning every 100 years. There is a minor continuity error where it was dusk in the opening shot and in the next shot it was nightfall, and by next shot I mean like in the next few seconds. But really, it's not a big deal at all. Definitely not as big of a deal as how much this episode likes to parade the fact that Spike is Twilight's #1 assistant. And this episode lays it on really, really thick, with characters like Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Rainbow Dash really loving Spike in this episode, showering him with compliments and gifts and making jokes around him. I feel the writer was trying to make them look sweet, but it got very distracting very quickly for me. Kinda similarly to the Season 7 episode, It Isn't the Main Thing About You, with Rarity's mane. After a certain point, I'm just like, okay, we get it. Later that night, Twilight's writing on a scroll, and the wind takes the paper out of her house. And herein begins my problems with this episode. Let's start off with the fact that she mentions needing Spike for this situation, because I guess this is something that he would do, get the paper back. But the paper was still in her view when she managed to step outside, and she's a unicorn. Considering how potent we've seen Twilight's magic to be earlier in the show, I have no idea why Twilight wouldn't just levitate the paper back into her house. This is something that she doesn't need an assistant for, but this episode wants to portray Twilight as being less competent than she actually is. And this is all for the sake of introducing Aloysius, who acts as Spike's foil in this episode. Now, 2 years ago, I called Aloysius a Mary Sue because Mr. Enter called Aloysius a Mary Sue. and I suffer from a very severe problem with dependency. Now, I can see why he considers Aloysius to be a Mary Sue, but the reality is that he's not. That being said, the way Aloysius is portrayed in this episode, it makes it very difficult to see him as being anything but perfect. And if not that, extremely close to perfect. First of all, the justification that Twilight gives for adopting Aloysius is because she needs an assistant at night, and Aloysius is nocturnal while Spike is diurnal. The problem is that Aloysius has also been doing Spike's chores during the day when he should be asleep. As a matter of fact, Aloysius is only ever shown to be awake in the entire episode, regardless of the time of day. So Spike's fear of being replaced by Aloysius comes off a lot less that he's being irrational, and a lot more of just the fact that this episode doesn't seem to understand nocturnal biology. If you want to say that owls are nocturnal, you should show that. This episode did not show that. It just told us that. And that's the last thing you want to do in writing a story. The rule is show, don't tell. Not tell, don't show. Another issue is just that Aloysius is shown to have no real weaknesses. In addition to being active all day long, he's also tough enough where he can fight a dragon literally all on his own, when not even Rainbow Dash can do that without getting swatted away. Another thing is that the following day, when Spike is reading a book about owls, Twilight's friends waste absolutely no time showering Aloysius with adulation, to the point where despite knowing Spike for several months and only then giving him a gem-encrusted bow tie as a gift, Aloysius got the exact same thing despite doing Rarity for at most literal minutes. And yes, this is another Mary Sue trope, considering that literally everyone else has no problem with Aloysius except the out-of-character character who's the main star of this episode. And yes, Spike is out of character. Twilight herself says it, so why refute it? He doesn't check all the boxes, he's not necessarily too attractive. He also doesn't really have much of a backstory, but he's a freaking owl and he's portrayed as an animal, not so much a person. The funny thing is, though, that this trope being a Mary Sue is normally applied to fanfiction. This episode just does a very bad job personifying Aloysius as a character. Back on the note of Twilight, she is really, really bad. Even though Spike was being extremely melodramatic the entire time, dude, he's a baby dragon. This episode calls him that, and we know how melodramatic kids can be as we've seen earlier in the show. Call of the Cutie is an excellent example of just that. Guess what Twilight never decides to do until it's almost too freaking late? Too late. She almost never takes the chance to reassure Spike that he's not being replaced. And you know what's really funny? Twilight recognizes the fact that Spike is worried about Aloysius. Shortly after that, when she and her friends can plainly see that Spike is upset, not only that, but Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy even acknowledge the fact that Spike is upset, potentially even feeling threatened over Aloysius. Twilight up and dismisses them, basically saying that Spike knows better than that. Here's a pro tip when dealing with kids. You can't just assume that they know anything. Oftentimes, when it comes to stuff like showing how much you love them, you do have to reaffirm that by telling them verbally that A, you love them, and B, nothing will change that. And it's not just a one and done thing either. That's something you have to repeatedly do. It may not always work, but it's your responsibility as the adult to do your part and make sure they actually feel safe. Something Twilight doesn't even attempt until Spike nearly gets killed. And leading up to that, she's acting entirely oblivious. Having Aloysius do Spike's chores in the middle of the freaking day, despite the owl being nocturnal, according to Twilight. Letting Spike run out to get a quill for you, even though you were trying to tell him before, barely, that you got a quill from Aloysius. And then while Spike is all huffy and upset that he got one-upped again, so upset in fact, that for a second he was able to perform pyrokinesis on that feather he got from the chicken. Twilight manages to demonstrate that she's somehow more blind than an actual blind person when it comes to reading emotional range. This is horrible. Like, I get the feeling that the writer's intent for this scene was just to show that Spike was still being valued around there. Twilight does point blank say that yeah, there are still a lot of chores for Spike to do, but after seeing just how frustrated Spike was at that point in the show, it just makes Twilight look extremely tone deaf. Following that, and Aloysius inadvertently got Spike into trouble, he dons a fake mustache, a cape, and a top hat, and tries to frame Aloysius for killing a mouse in Twilight's house. And I'm like, how was this supposed to work? Even if Twilight didn't catch Spike in the act, Aloysius is a wild animal. That would just mean that he was hungry and Twilight needed to feed the poor guy. which wouldn't really be out there considering that Aloysius has never shown to eat a single dang thing in the episode. It could also just mean that Twilight has a mouse infestation, meaning Aloysius would be even more useful. Spike, what the hell are you thinking? Shortly afterwards, he runs away from home and his feet are tracking with ketchup. And this is supposed to be important because it allows Twilight and Aloysius to track him down. There was even a trail of ketchup at the start of the third act. What's funny though is that in this episode it then starts to rain, which is not only a really cheap joke considering it happens immediately after Spike questions if things can get any worse, but it also creates a plot hole. Because as Spike's entering the cave, the trail of ketchup disappears, likely because of the rain that happened literally just a few seconds ago, and it only reappears when he's evacuating the cave with the dragon with Twilight and Aloysius. I also feel the need to mention this, but Aloysius being nocturnal, I don't really freaking care. Twilight complains about how it's dark and she can't see where she's going. She's a unicorn. Just illuminate the area with your magic. If freaking snails can do it, I know you can! I just cannot emphasize how dirty Twilight was done in this episode, and just how much less intelligent she's made out to be. And then there's Spike. I get that he's just a kid, so yeah, he's bound to get jealous, especially when no one's trying to correct his thinking. But there's so much dialogue as far as what he's actually thinking and what he feels in the show. It was one thing when he was talking to Aloysius, at least then he's talking to someone, but more often than not, he's talking to himself, expressing sentiments that could very easily be done visually, and that time that is spent just narrating his feelings could be used to further the story in other ways. Like, I don't know, have Spike leave Twilight a letter saying that he's running away. I get that it's possible that Twilight only thought to look for Spike because it was late that night, and she didn't see him home, which is valid, but considering how neglectful she's been this entire episode, even that's difficult to swallow. It's just blunder after blunder after blunder in this entire stupid story. No duh, it's a nightmare episode. Between the abysmal characterization, the absolutely god-awful storytelling, and the variety of plot holes this episode manages to fall into, it's just incredible that an episode like this managed to come about. There still are saving graces. I thought the moral itself was still pretty good. And for the most part, I did like the first act a fair bit too. It's just all buried under this massive stinking dumpster fire of writing in this episode. And that's the real shame, because I don't even really dislike Aloysius. I like the idea of Spike having a foil, and the concept itself isn't even really that bad either. Just the execution was so bad, it makes me want to execute this episode. What a shame that this is the first Spike episode in the entire show. Episode 25, Party of One. Pinkie Pie becomes suspicious of her friends when they avoid her party. Of all the episodes in Season 1 so far, this episode probably had the most to gain from being revisited. Because of how much more I understand Pinkie Pie's character now, I appreciate this episode so much more than I did back then. Not only because of this episode being really funny, but also the view it gives us into Pinkie Pie's psyche and what it tells us about her as a character. But let's take it from the top first. There's a lot of good humor in this episode, from the beginning to the end. Like in Gummy's first birthday party, we see Rarity drinking punch, and Gummy himself was actually stowing in the bowl. And I really love Rarity's reaction where she's trying to be nice and still drinking the punch, even though now she really doesn't want to. There's other scenes I also find to be really funny. My favorite's probably seeing Applejack try and lie to Pinkie Pie, and showing just how bad of a liar she actually is. The whole back and forth, especially when she's trying to lie about the ponies doing construction in her barn, all the while you know that Pinkie Pie is not buying it at all. It's all absolutely brilliant. This episode also just has some really good suspense the entire way through, which is actually pretty surprising how such a mundane plot can have so much entertainment value to it. But that's the mark of good characters and strong writing. Even something that on face value could look really dull can be salvaged if not even made to flourish with good writing. And for this show at least, Megan McCarthy is the queen of that. But yeah, I love all the scenes where the main six are trying to do their best to keep the party a secret when Pinkie Pie is trying to stalk them. Though admittedly, this scene also made me a little sad. Not because of anything this episode did, it's just that Rainbow Dash is actually smart enough to tell that Pinkie Pie is disguised as a hay bale here, which really spoke to me regarding her character derailment in Season 7, seeing daring done. If I had to be a little more negative though, I feel like the scenes where Pinkie Pie's friends are trying to come up with excuses left something to be desired. The fact that the main six are all saying this afternoon when trying to verify the time, it does come up pretty contrived. But there's enough variety to how they form their excuses to keep things interesting. Though I admittedly find it a little strange how somehow Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy are worse liars than Applejack. Really, you're housekeeping for a bear that lives in a cave, when you both can fly. Why not say you have business in Cloudsdale or something? I get that being bad liars here could very well be what sets Pinkie Pie off that there's something suspicious afoot, but not too long after Twilight's arriving in Sugar Cube Corner, when she was said to be studying. It's not that big of a deal, but I still find it to be pretty strange. And besides, there probably is an explanation I'm just not picking up on. Like, say, the main six are all caught off guard when Pinkie Pie is bringing up this after birthday party. It's very likely that because they were caught off guard, they were not able to think of a better excuse at the time, so I'll let it slide. Then there is also the moral, and I'll admit, I underrated the moral pretty dang hard when I first reviewed this episode. I feel like my problem was I was not paying enough attention when the moral was actually being delivered. I thought the show said to assume the best of your friends and never to assume the worst, when in reality it said to expect the best of your friends. There is actually a big difference between those two words. Assuming in general is a bad thing to do, because when you assume, it's often without any proof behind it. And if they're your friends, odds are you trust them at least a little. On the flip side, expecting the best of your friends, that generally means giving the benefit of the doubt. Now of course, you shouldn't be naive. If you see a proper cause for complaint, that's one thing. And Pinkie Pie at first does seem to have a cause for complaint. What makes this episode work, however, is that she's hyperbolic. And not to an unreasonable extent either. I mentioned this in Season 7 with my Triple Threat review. For Pinkie Pie, the thought of losing her friends would be catastrophic for her. But therein lies the key. It would be catastrophic for only her. As a result, the stakes themselves are much more reasonable. And the story itself still manages to function perfectly. Let this be a lesson that you don't need a lot to write a good episode. Especially when it means there's opportunities to see how much more complex the characters themselves can be. For example, Pinkie Pie. A character flaw of Pinkie Pie that's put right in the front and center of this episode is how heavily she prioritizes the happiness of others over herself. This is escalated by the fact that for Gumby's after birthday party, Pinkie Pie's friends all come up with excuses to say that they're occupied. Some may find it strange how Pony as party-centric as Pinkie Pie can forget her own birthday, which funnily enough, it seems to be the day after Gummies. But knowing it's Pinkie Pie and who she tends to make a priority in her life, it's honestly not too out there that she could forget her own birthday when she puts so much focus on others. And there is evidence to suggest that she tends to overthink things a lot. This all comes to a boil when she believes that her friends don't like her parties and don't want to be her friends anymore, which she only really thinks because Spike told her that, which she said she wanted to hear. And her psyche shatters, which really speaks to how important her friends are to her, not to mention just how much effort she puts into her parties. You could probably say that it was kind of mean of Spike to say what he did, but A, he was only telling Pinkie Pie what she wanted to hear, and B, he's still a child, and therefore his words don't really amount to much. Besides, as a whole, this scene was really funny. Though I'll admit, getting to see this side of Pinkie Pie, I'm a little concerned and just a tad bit creeped out. And you know what? I love it. Episode 26, The Best Night Ever. The main six partake at the Grand Galloping Gala, finding it's not all it's cracked up to be. So, overall thoughts on this episode? Despite the title calling it the best night ever, I find it to be pretty mid overall. By far, the best part of this episode, and for the record, the only character I was really rooting for the entire time, had to be Rarity. I'd say she was the only part of the episode I found to be actively enjoyable. Even from just the beginning, she is shown to have some really good moments, like using her charm and charisma to convince some stallions to help her and her friends get to the gala. It's a really funny scene when Twilight's original plan ends up failing, and it really highlights how resourceful Rarity is. The sad thing though is that Rarity not only carries the beginning, but is also actively carrying the gala itself when we get to the gala. Seeing her conflict with Prince Blueblood and how she's actively trying to look for the good in him, just to come to the realization that there is no good to find. They have a lot of fun scenes together, like when Blueblood sees the rose that Rarity had her eyes on and takes it for himself. Making her open the door for him, having her use her own clothes to block a puddle so that they don't slip on it. It's absolutely great, and I loved watching every scene with them together. The rest of the main six, meanwhile, are less enjoyable. Not necessarily bad. In fact, I'd say only one of their storylines was actually bad in my opinion, but the rest of them were at least okay. Though for Twilight, it often feels like nothing actually happens with her. She's just trying to find an audience with Princess Celestia, but she's too busy greeting guests to talk to her. It's pretty boring as a result. It's also really weird that this is the season finale of season 1, and yet Princess Luna is still nowhere to be seen. What, was she not invited? You gotta admit, that's just really weird. Meanwhile, for Pinkie Pie, I feel like knowing Rarity's interpretation of the Grand Galloping Gala back in the Ticketmaster, you should be able to see from a mile away that the party would not be what she expected it to be. Part of me feels like that's why the episode wants to show that Pinkie Pie was not having fun first when it came to what she was doing here, because otherwise it's like, no duh, really this is not the kind of party at all. And it's after Pinkie's scene where both she and her friend's scenes all go a very similar trajectory for the rest of the episode. At first, they're related, but after a while, they begin to realize that their time at the gala would not necessarily be the best night ever. They resolve to make it the best night ever, and then things get worse. I will say, I like how this episode is edited. No scene goes on for too long where you feel like you're bored just watching any old main 6 member unless their plotline is inherently boring. And the only two I would say are boring are Twilight and probably Applejack. Her plotline is that she's trying to sell her merchandise, but is not getting any business after the first pie sale. It's not bad, but it fails to leave a strong impression. And sadly, I don't think there's much you can do with Applejack considering the kind of character that she is. Then there's Rainbow Dash, and all she's trying to do is get the Wonderbolt's attention. That's literally all she tries to do, and it feels no different from Twilight's. It's still better than Twilight's, if only because I think Rainbow Dash's fangirling is absolutely adorable. And to be fair, she's actually trying to do stuff with the Wonderbolts as well, not just trying to talk. But a lot of her moments just feel like she's experiencing superhero syndrome, creating problems that only she can really solve. I feel like I'd appreciate her scenes more if there was more variety. Like if, say, her rescues were being interrupted by, say, another savior. Something like Season 7's hard to say anything. Again, the scenes aren't really bad, just a bit repetitive. At the very least, I can understand why Rainbow Dash is resorting to what she's doing. Something that I sadly cannot say for Fluttershy. I'll just cut to the chase. I did not like Fluttershy in this episode. Her whole story here is trying to befriend animals, but the majority of the time, she presents herself as an active threat to them. And it feels like it comes off as callous way too quickly. The first time she tries to respond to any animals, she tries to respond to a bird whistle, but finds it's just another pony. That on its own isn't really bad. No, what actually is bad is that she never tries to communicate to any animals at all for the rest of the episode. The rest of her scenes involve either trying to rush towards animals or trying to trap them, which for Fluttershy feels actively out of character for her. Maybe the episode tried to show her be more mild first, instead of trying to rush at animals, it'd be one thing. Or if, you know, we saw her trying to console the animals, reassure them that she's not a threat, before presenting any active danger to them by trying to rush them down. But no, she comes off more psychotic than sweet. And it's not funny. It doesn't feel like enough has actually happened to Fluttershy to warrant her breaking down the way she does. Especially for how quickly she tries to start trapping animals. Her cutie mark is literally there to symbolize that she can talk to them. And heck, is it a big part of kindness having empathy? No matter how you slice it, she doesn't feel like Fluttershy in this episode. If anything, she feels more like Elmira. Yeah, remember her from Tiny Toons? She loves animals, but often does more harm than good to them. And for Fluttershy, I must say, it's not a good look. Past the gala though, I think this episode is okay. There were some decently funny moments, the moral itself was alright. It talks about how a bad day when spent with friends can make things more enjoyable. And that is a moral I can get behind. You know what they say, cheerful company shortens the miles. And I'm happy that at least Spike got what he wanted out of the big night. But hey, for a finale, I would still say I at least had fun. And that is every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 1 Revisited. Looking at the statistics, we had 9 episodes I'd consider good, though with the guilty pleasure I'll chalk it up to 10, 5 episodes that were just okay, and get this, 10 episodes I consider nightmares. So a pretty even split of good and bad episodes alike. With that in mind, I think it's safe to say that this is an okay season. If we were to compare it this time around with my first go around reviewing Season 1, remember that back then it was 12 good episodes, 6 okay, and 7 nightmares. This is to say that I think there are less episodes in Season 1 that are good or okay. Still, it's not all doom and gloom, since at least this time around, a couple of episodes got better ratings than last time. namely the Ticketmaster and Green Isn't Your Color. Though yeah, quite a few episodes did come out of this with worse ratings. Griffon The Brush Off, Bridle Gossip, Swarm of the Century, Stairmaster, A Bird in the Hoof, The Best Night Ever, and I guess to an extent Over a Barrel. I don't really have any notes for Season 1 though, so let's just talk about my worst and best 5 episodes of the season, starting with the worst. 5th worst, Owl's Well That Ends Well. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is going to catch you by surprise, considering the fact that this was originally number 1 when I first reviewed Season 1. But the reality is, as bad as this episode actually was, I at least enjoyed the beginning before Aloysius came on screen. That, and I kinda enjoyed seeing Spike act like a total doofus in an ironic sense. Ignoring that though, Twilight is at her absolute worst in this episode, and the storytelling involving Spike's emotions is just really bad in general. 4th worst, Bridle Gossip. I think this episode fell off the absolute hardest when I came to revisit Season 1. In addition to awful characterization, especially from Pinkie Pie, the moral is just delivered in such an absolutely dishonest and manipulative way that it actively loses any and all meaning it could have possibly had. I'd rate this episode higher if not for Spike. He was actually fun to watch. 3rd worst, Look Before You Sleep. At least the previous 2 episodes did not bore me to tears. I don't have a problem with this show being low-key if it wants to be, but this episode is not low-key, it's dull. From the setting, to the characters, to the conflict. And if I had to choose between being bored or being frustrated with an episode, I'd choose being frustrated, because at least a frustrating episode could be fun to talk about. 2nd worst, The Showstoppers. So this and number 1, I would say I'm both bored by and frustrated by. The story here feels actively regressive, making it blatantly obvious what the CMC would be best at, just for them to never actually get a clue as far as what the actual answer is. As a viewer, it makes me feel like I'm being treated like an idiot. Beyond that, it's just so repetitive. Of all the episodes that will become worse from seeing them again, I did not think that this would be one of them. And now the first worst episode, Boast Busters. The ponies who challenged Trixie were supposed to like, hypocritical at best. The new characters we're introduced to, absolutely abysmal. Except for Trixie, but unfortunately, she got the shortest end of the stick possible. That aside, this episode also has Spike at his worst, where he's just irritating. I really don't know what there is to like about this episode. It's just an all-around utter train wreck. On the upside, the bad episodes are now out of the way, and we can focus on the good. So let's do it! 5th best, Call of the Cutie. Applebuck's antics here are just really fun to see. And given what was to follow, I think the ending here is one of the strongest the entire first season's ever had. It's also an episode that features Twilight very little if at all, which is a notable advantage for Season 1. All in all, a very strong showing. 4th best, The Cutie Mark Chronicles. This anthology is just so cute. I really enjoy the framing device of the CMC trying to find Rainbow Dash to hear her story about her cutie mark. It gives a lot of good energy to the story as it progresses. And the stories themselves range from funny to just downright endearing. Good episodes of Friendship is Magic generally don't have any dull moments, but this episode is impressive in the sense that it juggles 6 different stories, and not one of them feels like it either overstays its welcome, or just isn't given enough time. Masterful work. 3rd best, Sonic Rainboom. Whenever I watch this episode again and again, I just like it more and more. There's just so much I find so sweet about it, that I just can't help but smile whenever I watch it again. From seeing Rainbow Dash see her friends first arrive in Cloudfield to cheer her on, to when she actually pulls out the Sonic Rainboom and saves everyone, including Rarity, the story is just full of phenomenal power plays. Way to go, Rainbow Dash. Way to go. 2nd best, Suited for Success. The story here is about as strong as the song that's being sung in it. I love how much attention this episode pays to little details, like how hard Rarity works on her craft. Just all the time and all of the effort she puts into everything she does here. It also made clear that Rarity's a much better character than first given credit for. Consider me a fan. And now, number 1, my favorite episode of Season 1, Dragonshy. Try as I might, I can't find a single thing wrong with this episode. Not one single thing. Instead, all I found were extremely likable characters, a very fun conflict, lots of big laughs, and a shining example of what makes Fluttershy such a compelling character. Dragonshy absolutely holds a candle to even some of the best episodes of the future seasons in the show, which is saying a lot because Season 1 has a reputation of being a little rough around the edges. And I dare say that if this episode is this good in this season of the show, then I am very much looking forward to seeing Season 2 once again. And I certainly hope you'll join me when it actually happens. Until next time, this is Orantula signing out. Thank you for watching.